For 8 years, I sacrificed my savings, my marriage, and my physical health to keep my father's international logistics company alive. At the promotion dinner, he smiled, raised his crystal glass, and told a room full of investors that my sister deserved to be CEO. I resigned that exact night. By Monday, the phone stopped ringing, the servers crashed, and the absolute panic began. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old. Before I tell you how I walked away and watched their stolen empire collapse under the weight of their own incompetence, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you believe that blind family loyalty is a dangerous game. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one of your comments, and they mean the world to me. Now let me take you back to the night my family shattered my trust and handed me the scissors to cut them off forever. The oak room at the Belmont Country Club smelled of roasted prime rib, aged mahogany, and expensive perfume. It was a Friday night in late October. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the atmosphere was warm and electric. Sterling Global was celebrating a record-breaking financial quarter, a quarter that had pulled us back from the brink of total bankruptcy. I arrived an hour early to ensure the seating arrangements were perfect, and the caterers had the exact vintage of champagne my father requested. I was exhausted. My feet ached in my heels, and I had a dull pulsing headache behind my eyes from staring at supply chain spreadsheets since 4 in the morning. But beneath the exhaustion, my heart was racing with genuine, unadulterated hope. Tonight was the night. My father Richard had hinted at it for weeks. He was stepping back, transitioning to chairman of the board, and he was finally going to name his successor as chief executive officer. I was currently the vice president of operations, but that title was a joke. I was running the entire company. As I stood by the grand fireplace waiting for the guests to arrive, I let myself reflect on exactly what it had cost me to keep Sterling Global afloat. When I joined the company 8 years ago, right out of college, we were bleeding money. Our domestic shipping routes were obsolete, and our manual accounting systems were a disaster. I gave up my 20s to fix it. I worked 80-hour weeks, skipping holidays and canceling vacations. I built complex, multi-step digital workflows from absolute scratch that automated our entire European and Asian supply chains. I sacrificed my personal life completely. My ex-husband David packed his bags 3 years ago because I was always at the office, always taking midnight calls from overseas vendors, always prioritizing my father's legacy over our marriage. I did not fight David when he left because I knew he was right. I was married to the firm, but I did not just work hard. I made myself the undeniable backbone of the operation. When our European vendors refused to communicate effectively in English, I spent my rare free hours studying. I became completely fluent in Italian and German, allowing me to negotiate massive freight discounts directly with the supplier heads in Milan and Munich. When I realized the Asian market was the absolute strategic future of our industry, I spent 2 grueling years learning Mandarin. Those language skills secured exclusive manufacturing contracts that saved Sterling Global from going under. I did all of the heavy lifting, the negotiating, the late-night crisis management. I earned the CEO title with my blood, my sweat, and the ashes of my youth. The double doors of the oak room swung open, interrupting my thoughts. My father walked in looking sharp in a tailored tuxedo, projecting the aura of a self-made titan. Flanking him were my younger sister Chloe and her husband Bradley. Chloe was 28 and had never worked a full 40-hour week in her entire life. She held a vague title at Sterling Global as the Director of Corporate Culture, which meant she planned the holiday party and occasionally posted on the company social media accounts. Tonight, she was wearing a stunning designer gown that cost more than my first car. Bradley walked beside her wearing a smug expression and a luxury watch. Bradley was a real estate agent who spent more time on the golf course than showing houses. He came from a wealthy local family, and my father absolutely fawned over his country club connections. Chloe spotted me by the fireplace and sighed, handing me her wet coat like I was the coat check girl. "You look tired, Claire," she said, not bothering to hide the condescension in her voice. "You really should have gotten your makeup done professionally. Tonight is a big deal for the family." I took her coat, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my mouth shut. "I am fine, Chloe. I was up late closing the Shanghai contract so we could announce the quarterly numbers tonight." Bradley chuckled, patting my shoulder with heavy condescension. That is our Claire. Always in the trenches. Someone has to do the boring paperwork, right? My father smiled warmly at them, completely ignoring their disrespect. Go mingle, you two, he said, ushering them toward the bar. Bradley, the investors from the bank are here. Go work your magic. As the room filled with 30 of our most important investors, board members, and extended family, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I pushed it down. My father had promised me this. He had sat across from me in my cramped office just last week, looking at the record profits, and told me that my sacrifice would finally be rewarded. Dinner was served. The clinking of crystal and the low hum of wealthy conversation filled the room. I sat to the right of my father. Chloe and Bradley sat to his left. I could barely eat my prime rib. I just kept going over my acceptance speech in my head, planning how I would thank the team, outline my vision for the next 5 years, and finally step out of the shadows. When the dessert plates were cleared, my father stood up. He picked up his butter knife and tapped it against his champagne glass. The sharp, clear ringing brought the entire room to a hushed silence. Family, friends, and esteemed partners, my father began, his voice booming with practiced charisma. Tonight, we celebrate a monumental milestone. Sterling Global has achieved record growth. We have expanded our reach across Europe and Asia, and our future has never looked brighter. The room erupted in polite applause. I smiled, feeling a rush of genuine pride. I had built that expansion, but a company must evolve. My father continued, raising his hands to quiet the room. To reach the next tier of global commerce, we need fresh energy. We need leadership that understands the art of the deal, the importance of high society networking, and the prestige of the Sterling name. For the past 30 years, I have proudly served as your chief executive officer. Tonight, I am officially stepping down from that role to become chairman of the board. The silence in the room was absolute. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I adjusted my posture, preparing to stand. I need a successor who can be the bold, vibrant face of our future, my father said, turning his gaze to his left, completely away from me. Someone who understands relationships. Someone who has the right connections to bring elite investors to our table. Therefore, it is my greatest honor to introduce the new CEO of Sterling Global, my beautiful daughter, Chloe. The words did not make sense. They sounded like a foreign language I had not yet learned. I sat frozen, staring straight ahead as the room exploded into thunderous applause. Chloe feigned a gasp of surprise, covering her mouth with her manicured hands before standing up. Bradley kissed her on the cheek, pumping his fist in the air. The investors cheered. Board members stood up to raise their glasses. I looked at my father. He was clapping loudly, beaming with pride as he looked at Chloe. He did not look at me. Not once. A cold, heavy numbness washed over my entire body. It started in my fingertips and spread to my chest, suffocating the air from my lungs. The ringing in my ears drowned out the applause. Chloe, who could not read a basic profit and loss statement. Chloe, who did not know the difference between a freight forwarder and a customs broker. Chloe, who spoke no other languages and took 3-hour lunches, was now the CEO of the company I had sacrificed my marriage to save. Chloe took the microphone from my father. Thank you so much. She gushed, her voice sickeningly sweet. I am just so humbled. Bradley and I have so many amazing ideas for the company culture. We are going to bring Sterling Global into the modern era. I do not remember the rest of her speech. I do not remember the toasts or the dessert course. I simply sat there, trapped in a glass box of betrayal, realizing that the last 8 years of my life had been a complete and utter lie. I was not building a legacy. I was building a throne for the golden child to sit on. As the formal portion of the evening ended and the guests began to mingle near the bar, I finally stood up. My legs felt like lead. I walked over to the corner of the room where my father was standing alone, checking his phone. Dad, I said. My voice was eerily calm, stripped of all emotion. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second I saw a flash of guilt cross his face before he masked it with his usual authoritative charm. Claire, sweetie, great night, right? The investors loved it. We talked about this, I said, keeping my voice low so the guests would not hear. You told me I was taking over. You looked me in the eye and told me my sacrifices were going to be rewarded. My father sighed, a heavy, patronizing sound. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Claire, you have to look at the big picture, he said, smoothly slipping into his boardroom voice. Chloe is married to Bradley. Bradley plays golf with the heads of the 3 biggest private equity firms in the state. Chloe has the social grace, the look, the connections. She needs this title to elevate their status in the community. She does not know how to run a logistics company, I stated flatly. She does not even know the login credentials for our central server. That is exactly why I need you, my father said, smiling, as if he were handing me a compliment. You are the backbone, Claire. You are the smartest person in the room. You will keep doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. You will run the day-to-day operations, manage the overseas vendors, and handle the workflows. Chloe will just be the face of the company. It is a partnership. I stared at the man who raised me, the man I had worshipped and worked myself to the bone for. He was not asking me to be a partner. He was commanding me to be a ghost. He expected me to continue working 80 hours a week speaking Mandarin at 2 in the morning and fixing shipping crises while Chloe collected the massive CEO salary and took the credit at country club luncheons. You want me to do all the work so she can wear the crown, I said. Don't be dramatic, Claire. My father snapped his warm facade, dropping instantly. His tone turned sharp and commanding. This is a family company. We all play our parts. You know how sensitive your sister is. She needs a win. You have always been the tough one. You do not need the validation of a title. I expect you to be a team player and support your sister. I looked across the room. Chloe was holding a glass of champagne, throwing her head back in laughter at something an investor said. Bradley had his arm around her waist, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They were celebrating a victory they had stolen with my father's eager help. For 8 years, I thought my father demanded so much of me because he respected me. In that corner of the oak room, the devastating truth finally locked into place. He did not respect me. He used me. He used my loyalty, my work ethic, and my desperate desire for his approval to fund a lavish, unearned life for the daughter he actually favored. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. I am an operations expert. I deal in logistics and variables and in precise execution. Emotional outbursts are inefficient. I reached into my designer clutch. My fingers wrapped around the heavy ring of keys, the master key to the office, the key to the server room, the key to the executive suite. I pulled them out and held them in the palm of my hand. I am not being dramatic, Richard, I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. I am simply resigning. My father actually laughed, a short, dismissive scoff. Stop it, Claire. You are upset. You have had a long week. Go home, get some sleep, and I will see you at the office on Monday morning. We have the German contract to finalize. I did not argue. I walked past him, returning to my seat at the long-abandoned dining table. My plate of prime rib sat exactly where I left it, entirely untouched. I placed my heavy ring of company keys squarely in the center of the cold meat. They landed with a dull, wet thud. I turned around and walked toward the exit. Claire, my father called out, his voice sharp with a sudden spike of panic as he noticed the keys on the table. Claire, get back here right now. You cannot just leave. We have shipments sitting in ports right now. I did not turn back. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the Belmont Country Club and stepped out into the freezing October rain. The valet brought my car around, and as I sat in the driver's seat, the cold leather seeping through my damp dress, I did not shed a single tear. I felt a terrifying, chilling sense of absolute clarity. My father thought I was throwing a tantrum. He thought I would be back at my desk on Monday morning answering the phones and keeping the ship afloat because I had always been the dependable, obedient daughter. He had completely forgotten one crucial detail. I built every single automated workflow in that company. I owned the vendor relationships. I was the only person who spoke the languages required to keep the freight moving across the globe. Without me, Sterling Global was just a fancy logo and a room full of people wearing expensive suits who had no idea how to turn on the engine. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the country club. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a text from my father demanding I answer him immediately. I turned the phone off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. They wanted Chloe to be the CEO. They were about to find out exactly what that cost. The drive home from the country club was a blur of rain, adrenaline, and fractured memories. My windshield wipers slapped back and forth, a rhythmic, metronomic beat that echoed the hammering in my chest. Chloe. The name tasted like ash in my mouth. For 8 years, I had built my life around Sterling Global. No, not just built, I had poured myself into it until there was nothing left of Claire but spreadsheets, time zones, and the relentless grinding hum of the supply chain. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. At 23, I hadn't just accepted a job, I'd accepted a mission. The company had been hemorrhaging capital when I started. Our domestic routes were bleeding cash, outpaced by modern logistics, and our accounting systems were archaic, prone to human error that cost us tens of thousands every quarter. I hadn't just fixed the problem, I had rebuilt the entire engine while the plane was in the air. I thought about David. The memory of his packed suitcase sitting by the front door 3 years ago suddenly felt sharp and raw. "You're married to the firm Claire," he'd said, his voice void of anger, just heavy with resignation. "You love Richard's approval more than you love me." I hadn't stopped him. I hadn't begged him to stay because, God help me, I thought he was wrong. I thought I was securing our future. I worked 80-hour weeks missing our anniversaries, answering urgent emails during his mother's funeral, all because my father had convinced me that the company's survival depended on my sacrifice. "You're the backbone, Claire. I need you." The words had been a drug, and I had been an eager addict. And why wouldn't I believe him? Without me, Sterling Global would have collapsed 5 years ago. When we decided to pivot to the European market, our primary vendors in Milan and Munich had stonewalled us. They were old-school proud and completely unwilling to negotiate complex shipping tariffs in English. My father had panicked. Chloe had suggested sending them gift baskets. I had spent the next 18 months sleeping 4 hours a night, hiring private tutors, and consuming language apps during my commute until I was fluent in Italian and German. I was the one who flew to Milan, sat in smoke-filled offices, and negotiated the freight discounts that saved our margins in the native tongues of men who refused to respect anyone who didn't speak their language. When the market shifted to Asia, I didn't hesitate. I recognized the strategic necessity of the Shanghai ports. While Chloe was planning wellness retreats for the HR department, I was learning Mandarin. 2 years of brutal, mind-numbing study. But it worked. I secured the exclusive manufacturing contracts that transformed Sterling Global from a struggling domestic carrier into a legitimate international player. I had built a labyrinth of multi-step automated digital workflows that connected our European and Asian supply chains flawlessly. The entire system ran on the architecture I had coded, negotiated, and maintained. I was the linchpin. If you pulled me out, the whole machine would grind to a catastrophic halt. I merged onto the highway, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. "You will keep doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes." My father's words replayed in my mind, stripping away years of illusion with terrifying clarity. He didn't value my brilliance or my dedication, he valued my utility. Growing up, Chloe had always been the sun. I was just the orbit. When she scraped her knee, it was a tragedy. When I broke my arm, it was an inconvenience. But I had convinced myself that adulthood was different. I believed that business was a meritocracy. I thought my father's demands were a sign of respect, a recognition of my competence. I was wrong. He had weaponized my desire for his approval. He had exploited my desperate need to be seen as valuable. He used my labor, my exhaustion, and the ashes of my marriage to fund a throne for Chloe. Because Chloe was pretty. Because Chloe married Bradley, the real estate agent with country club connections. Because Chloe fit the picture of the perfect socialite daughter that he wanted to present to the world. He didn't just want me to work for her. He wanted me to willingly accept my place in the shadows so she could shine in the light. I pulled into my driveway, the rain still drumming against the roof of the car. I turned off the engine, but I didn't get out. I sat in the darkness, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me. There was no grief, no overwhelming wave of sadness. What I felt was a cold, absolute realization settling into my bones. I had given them my youth, my health, and my marriage. They had taken it all without a second thought, assuming my loyalty was endless, assuming I would always be the dependable, obedient workhorse. They thought they owned me. They were about to learn what happens when the workhorse decides to break the plow. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of charcoal gray clouds pressing down on the city skyline. The streets were completely barren when I pulled my car into the underground parking garage of Sterling Global. The concrete structure echoed with the hollow, lonely sound of my tires gripping the damp pavement. I parked in my usual spot, the one closest to the freight elevator. It was a deeply ingrained habit formed from 8 long years of arriving before the sun came up and leaving long after the cleaning crews had gone home. Today, however, I was not here to fix a sudden supply chain crisis or negotiate a last-minute tariff reduction. I was here to systematically erase my entire presence from the building. I swiped my security keycard at the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. The electronic lock flashed green with a sharp, definitive click. The office was dead silent. There were no ringing phones, no frantic voices shouting across the logistics floor, no dull hum of the daily corporate grind. It was just me and the suffocating ghost of my sacrificed youth. I walked straight down the long carpeted hallway to my office, deliberately bypassing the massive corner suite that my father had so publicly handed over to my sister the night before. The heavy brass nameplate on my door still read, Vice President of Operations. I scoffed quietly at the title. It had always been a decorative lie, a cheap consolation prize meant to keep me working 80-hour weeks while they reaped the rewards. I did not bother turning on the overhead fluorescent lights. The weak, filtering morning light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows was more than enough. I pulled 2 standard cardboard banker boxes from the supply closet and started tossing my sparse personal belongings inside. I packed my framed university degree. I packed the vintage desktop globe my ex-husband David had bought me for our first wedding anniversary, back when we actually had time to celebrate milestones, before this company swallowed our marriage whole. I packed the dog-eared Italian and German business dictionaries. I had painstakingly memorized cover to cover on red-eye flights. Packing my physical items took less than 20 minutes because I had never truly decorated this space. I had practically lived in it, survived in it, bled for it, but it had never been a home. The real critical task ahead of me was the digital cleanup. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and powered up my workstation. The dual monitors flared to bright life, illuminating my face in a stark, cold blue glow. I had personally designed the entire corporate network architecture for Sterling Global. Every server, every backup protocol, every encrypted overseas vendor portal was a direct product of my own relentless effort. I knew the digital veins and arteries of this system better than I knew my own heartbeat. My goal this morning was straightforward and clinical. I wanted to wipe my personal files, clear my sprawling browsing history, and download clean copies of my original automated workflow templates. Those intricate templates, legally and intellectually, belonged to me, and I refused to leave them behind for Chloe to blindly profit from. As I initiated the primary backup sequence, a strange, glaring anomaly caught my eye on the screen. The root server directory displayed a partitioned network drive I had absolutely never created. It was labeled simply as SG Management Archive. It sat completely outside the standard financial operating system, cloaked heavily behind a dual authentication firewall that looked hastily constructed. Most employees would have completely ignored it, assuming it was a leftover IT artifact from a previous software update. But I was the one who built the foundational firewall for the firm. I knew exactly what belonged in that directory and what did not. Curiosity is a highly dangerous instinct when you already feel the sting of deep betrayal. I opened my developer command terminal and swiftly bypassed the standard user interface. The security protocol guarding the hidden drive was surprisingly sloppy, clearly set up by an overpriced third-party vendor who did not understand the deep backdoors I had permanently hard-coded into the root directory years ago. Within 3 intense minutes, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, I broke right through the encryption. The hidden folder opened. I braced myself, expecting to find old HR disciplinary records or perhaps outdated tax filings my father wanted hidden from the general accounting staff. Instead, I found a master financial ledger that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. The file was a massive, intricately linked spreadsheet clearly programmed to update automatically every Friday at midnight. I clicked on the most recent tab, dated just hours before my explosive resignation at the country club. The widescreen instantly populated with hundreds of rows of raw financial data. At first glance, the sheer volume of numbers made absolutely no sense to my tired brain. I saw the massive incoming revenue streams from the Shanghai and Munich contracts. These were the exact international manufacturing deals I had personally negotiated, spending years, mastering Mandarin and German, just to get the vendor principals to the table. I knew those specific revenue numbers by heart because I had fought tooth and nail in smoke-filled overseas boardrooms for every single fraction of a percentage point in profit margin. I had literally sacrificed my physical health, suffering through chronic insomnia and stress migraines to secure those exact funds. But as I scrolled further to the right, the outgoing expense columns did not match our operational reality at all. According to the official company books that I was allowed to see, Sterling Global was constantly operating on a razor-thin, terrifying margin. For 8 years, my father had sat across from me with a grave expression telling me we were barely surviving the quarter. He used our alleged financial distress to justify my perpetually frozen salary, my non-existent holiday bonuses, and the crushing pressure he placed squarely on my shoulders to perform miracles. The hidden ledger glowing brightly in front of me told a completely different, horrifying story. Sterling Global was not struggling. It was not barely surviving. The company was generating massive overflowing cash reserves month after month, and those enormous reserves were being systematically, ruthlessly siphoned out before they ever reached the official corporate accounts that the IRS or the lower-level accountants could see. Millions of dollars in untaxed, intentionally diverted profits were flowing directly into 3 private offshore holding companies. My hands turned to absolute ice as I cross-referenced the corporate tax identification numbers of those specific holding companies using a public registry database. The first shell company belonged directly to Richard Sterling, my father. I opened the corresponding expense folder attached to his name and felt the air physically, violently leave my lungs. While I was actively clipping grocery coupons and buying my professional work suits from discount outlets to save money for the firm, my father was secretly funding a life of absolute hidden luxury. The documented proof was right there on the screen. There were scanned receipts for a massive private yacht charter in the Mediterranean, dated during a week he claimed he was at a grueling logistics conference in Ohio. There were heavy wire transfers for a sprawling multi-million-dollar oceanfront property in Boca Raton. There were endless invoices for custom-tailored Italian suits, vintage wine collections, and exotic sports cars. He had looked me directly in the eye, held my hands, told me we had to tighten our belts to save the family legacy, and then used my hard-earned Asian market revenue to buy a luxury vacation home I was never even invited to visit. The sheer scale of the betrayal did not stop with him. The second holding company was registered to Chloe. My jaw clenched so tightly my back teeth ached as I clicked on her detailed transaction history. Her supposed 6-figure CEO salary was just the absolute tip of the iceberg. The ledger revealed a constant, sickening daily flow of stolen corporate funds, paying for every aspect of her lavish, unearned lifestyle. That massive, pristine McMansion she and Bradley lived in, the one they smugly claimed they bought entirely with Bradley's lucrative real estate commissions. It was a complete lie. The house was fully funded by the European shipping routes I had painstakingly automated. My complex multi-step digital workflows were literally paying her exorbitant mortgage every single month. I saw the receipts for her designer wardrobes, her purebred dogs, and her expensive country club memberships. Every time she had condescendingly told me I looked tired and needed a vacation, she was wearing clothes bought with money stolen directly from my sleepless nights. And Bradley, the smug son-in-law, was certainly not left out of the feast. The third holding company was tied directly to his name and his various business entities. The flashy tech startups he constantly bragged about at family dinners, the ones that always mysteriously folded after 18 months, claiming market shifts were not legitimate businesses at all. They were carefully designed black holes for embezzled corporate capital. My father was intentionally funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Bradley's failed hollow ventures just to keep up the grand illusion of his son-in-law's wild success among their elite social circles. They were all in on it, a perfect parasitic ecosystem feeding entirely on my blind loyalty and relentless work ethic. I sat perfectly still in the sterile glow of the monitors. The heavy silence of the empty office pressed aggressively against my ears, magnifying the sound of my own shallow breathing. For a brief, agonizing moment, a wave of profound, soul-crushing heartbreak washed over my entire body. It was a physical pain, sharp and suffocating. I thought about my ex-husband David packing his bags by the front door, begging me to choose our marriage over the company. I thought about the chronic stress migraines that forced me to keep the lights off in my apartment for days at a time. I thought about the winter holidays I spent entirely alone in sterile hotel rooms overseas, eating cold room service while aggressively negotiating with shipping magnates, genuinely deeply believing I was saving my family from total financial ruin. They had stolen my entire 20s. They had drained my youth, my vibrant energy, and my marriage to fund their grotesque vanity. They did not just take my money or my career, they took my one and only life, and they laughed behind my back while doing it. But that paralyzing heartbreak lasted exactly 60 seconds. Then something deep inside my chest snapped completely shut. The desperate tears I thought I might cry never arrived. The suffocating grief evaporated into thin air, replaced instantly by a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly absolute clarity. I did not feel the sudden urge to scream. I did not want to smash my expensive dual monitors with a chair, or march over to my father's pristine corner office and violently trash his custom mahogany desk. I am a senior operations expert. I am a master of global logistics, complex variables, and precise, unyielding execution. Emotional outbursts are a fatal weakness, a messy, unpredictable liability that only serves to tip your hand to the enemy. I knew right then, staring at the cold, hard data, that I was no longer dealing with a simple family misunderstanding or a case of toxic favoritism. I was dealing with a meticulously organized, highly illegal criminal enterprise operated by the very people who shared my last name. I reached into the bottom of my leather work bag and pulled out a high-capacity, military-grade, encrypted solid-state drive I kept for emergency server backups. I plugged it directly into the secure hidden port on the main server rack beneath my desk. I did not just copy the master financial ledger, I dragged every single hidden file, every damning wire transfer confirmation, every forged corporate expense report, and every piece of encrypted email communication onto my secure drive. I moved methodically, my fingers flying across the keyboard with absolute punishing precision. I downloaded 8 entire years of their systematic financial fraud. I took the yacht receipts. I took the fraudulent mortgage payments for Chloe's McMansion. I took the undeniable digital trail proving that Richard and Chloe had been aggressively skimming millions off the top of the international vendor contracts I legally secured under my own name. The massive download took 45 grueling, tense minutes. I sat there watching the green progress bar slowly creep across the screen, calculating my exact devastating next steps. They thought I was just their dependable, obedient workhorse. They thought I would blindly, quietly accept my sister taking the executive crown while I continued to shovel coal into the engine room to keep their luxury ship moving forward. They had entirely fatally underestimated the extreme danger of handing complete systemic control of an empire to the exact person they were endlessly exploiting. When the download bar finally reached 100%, a quiet chime echoed in the room. I safely ejected the encrypted drive and slipped it deep into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. The physical weight of it against my chest felt exactly like a loaded weapon primed and ready to fire. I carefully closed all the hidden server directories. I meticulously reset the complex firewall protocols exactly as I had found them, wiping the access logs and leaving absolutely no digital footprint of my morning intrusion. I wanted them to feel entirely secure. I wanted them to spend their weekend sipping expensive champagne at the country club, celebrating Chloe's unearned, fraudulent promotion completely and blissfully unaware that the foundational evidence of their entire fake empire was currently sitting in my pocket. I powered down the workstation, watching the screens fade to black. I gathered my 2 small cardboard boxes of personal items, turned off the desk lamp, and walked out of the office. I did not look back. I stepped into the waiting freight elevator and pressed the button for the underground parking garage. By Monday morning, the overseas vendors in Asia and Europe were going to realize they were not dealing with me anymore. The massive language barriers would hit like a brick wall. The highly automated shipping workflows would suddenly require complex manual overrides that Chloe did not even begin to understand. The absolute panic was going to set in rapidly, and when it finally did, I would be completely out of reach, silently holding the match that would inevitably burn Sterling Global completely to the ground. Monday morning arrived with a crisp and biting chill that seeped through the glass of my living room windows. Normally, my alarm would have gone off at 4 in the morning. I would have already been 2 cups of coffee deep by now, frantically reviewing the overnight shipping manifests from our European ports while trying to put on mascara in the rearview mirror of my car. I would have been fielding frantic text messages from the warehouse floor before the sun even thought about rising over the horizon. But today, I woke up at 7 in the morning, completely naturally. The sunlight filtered through my bedroom blinds, casting long and peaceful shadows across the hardwood floor. It was a strange and almost alien sensation to experience this absolute quiet. For 8 long, grueling years, Monday mornings were a battlefield where I was the commanding officer. Today, I was just a civilian watching the war from a safe distance. I walked into my kitchen and took my time brewing a proper pot of coffee. I listened to the rhythmic drip of the water, smelling the rich and dark roast filling the room. I poured myself a heavy mug, wrapped both of my hands around the warm ceramic, and walked back over to my living room window. I looked out at the quiet suburban street, watching the world wake up. Neighbors were backing out of their driveways, were rushing off to their corporate jobs, entirely unaware that a multi-million-dollar international logistics empire was about to crash straight into a solid brick wall. I sat down on my couch and placed my cell phone on the coffee table right in front of me. The screen was completely dark. It was 7:45 in the morning. The official start time for the executive staff at Sterling Global was exactly 8 o'clock. That was the precise moment when the domestic dispatchers handed over the overnight logs to the senior management team. That was when my custom automated workflows were supposed to verify the international customs declarations and release the locked funds for the day's freight movements across 3 different continents. But those complex workflows required a manual dual-factor authentication override every single Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. It was an override that only I possessed the credentials for. I had deliberately not automated this final step simply because international banking regulations required a live executive sign off to release funds of that magnitude. Without my specific digital signature, the system would freeze to protect the assets. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It tasted absolutely incredible. It tasted like pure, unadulterated freedom. I watched the digital clock on my microwave transition from 7:59 to 8 o'clock. I held my breath. 10 seconds passed, then 20. At exactly 8 o'clock and 30 seconds, my cell phone screen lit up. The silent and violent vibration buzzed heavily against the glass of the coffee table. The caller ID flashed brightly, identifying the incoming call as the IT department for Sterling Global. I did not reach for it. I just sat there with my heart beating in a steady and calm rhythm, watching the phone buzz until it finally went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was the domestic freight manager, a dedicated man named Thomas, who had relied on me for 5 years to untangle every single mess the sales team created. I felt a brief flash of guilt for Thomas. He was just trying to do his job and support his family. But Thomas worked for my father, and saving Thomas meant saving the very people who had ruthlessly stolen my entire future. I let the phone ring. By 8:15, the phone was ringing continuously. The screen never went dark. There was an incoming call from the accounting department, then an incoming call from the warehouse floor manager, then an incoming call from Chloe. I actually smiled a deep and genuine smile when my sister's name appeared on the glowing screen. I could picture her standing in her massive and stolen corner office, wearing some ridiculous designer suit, holding her phone with a perfectly manicured hand, completely panicked because the dual monitors on her expensive mahogany desk were currently flashing bright red error codes. Without my authentication, the central logistics software was designed to go into an immediate defensive lockdown. It was a strict security protocol I had personally coded from scratch to prevent cyber attacks from overseas competitors. If the system did not receive my specific administrative handshake, it assumed the network was fatally compromised. It would systematically sever the digital connection between our domestic dispatchers and the international freight forwarders. The massive transport trucks sitting at the ports in Seattle and Los Angeles would not receive their digital bills of lading. The cargo ships docking in Rotterdam would not get their customs clearance certificates. The entire global supply chain, a massive and humming machine that moved millions of dollars of physical goods every single day, was currently grinding to a devastating and screeching halt. My phone chimed with the new voicemail notification, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. I picked up the device, tapped the screen, and put the first message on speakerphone so the sound would fill my quiet living room. It was Thomas, the freight manager. His voice was completely breathless and entirely laced with raw panic. "Claire, please pick up the phone right now. I do not know what is going on. The entire dispatch board just went totally blind. Every single route has a red padlock icon next to it, and the drivers are calling from the ports, screaming at me, saying their release codes are invalid." I tried to ask Chloe for the executive override credentials, but she literally does not know what a release code is. She told me to turn the computer off and on again. "Claire, please call me back immediately. The Seattle Port Authority is threatening to impound 3 of our trucks if we do not move them out of the active loading bays in the next 10 minutes. I deleted the message with a single swipe of my thumb. I did not feel joy exactly. Joy is far too light a word for what I was experiencing in that moment. It was vindication. Cold and hard and undeniable vindication. For years, my father and sister had treated my brilliance like it was a basic utility, like running water or electricity. They simply expected the lights to turn on when they flipped the switch, completely ignoring the person shoveling coal into the furnace to keep the power running. Now they were sitting entirely in the dark, and they had absolutely no idea how to find the breaker box. But the domestic software crash was just the initial tremor of the earthquake. The real devastation hit precisely at 9 o'clock. My father and sister had been aggressively skimming millions of dollars off the top of our most lucrative international contracts, funneling that money into their private shell companies to fund their luxury lifestyles. To hide their massive theft from the lower-level accountants, they had been intentionally delaying necessary payments to our primary overseas shipping partners. They were floating the entire logistics company on a highly dangerous wave of unpaid debt, assuming I would always be there to miraculously smooth things over. I had spent the last 2 years constantly apologizing to angry vendors in Munich and Shanghai, using every ounce of my diplomatic skill and language fluency to beg for extensions, promising them the funds were simply caught in standard international banking delays. I had kept the vendor relationships alive purely through personal trust and mutual respect. Now I was gone, and those international vendors wanted their money immediately. My phone began receiving urgent calls with international country codes. Germany, Italy, China. I listened to the voicemails as they rolled in back to back. The first was from Herr Müller, the powerful head of our largest European shipping syndicate located in Munich. His deep voice boomed through my living room speaker, speaking rapidly in angry German. "Claire, what in the world is happening over there? My accounting department tells me the wire transfer you promised last Friday has not arrived in our accounts. I called your central office and spoke to some woman named Chloe, who tried to speak to me in slow English like I am an idiot tourist. She had absolutely no idea who I was or what the Munich contract even entails. I am halting all your outbound freight across Europe immediately until this is resolved. Call me back right now." The second voicemail was from Mr. Zhang, our primary manufacturing logistics partner in Shanghai. He spoke in sharp and clipped Mandarin. His tone was absolutely furious and completely unforgiving. "Claire, this situation is entirely unacceptable. The cargo is sitting frozen on the dock. Your sister answered the main phone line and actually tried to transfer me to a generic customer service representative. We do not deal with customer service. We deal with you directly. Because the massive invoices from last quarter are still outstanding, I have formally instructed my port managers to freeze all Sterling Global physical assets until the debt is cleared in full. You have 4 hours to wire the funds or we terminate the contract." I sat back against my soft couch cushions, taking a deep and ragged breath. Millions of dollars in commercial freight were now officially frozen on foreign soil. Without the ability to speak fluent Mandarin or German, my sister Chloe was completely and utterly powerless to negotiate. She could not charm her way out of this international crisis. She could not use her husband Bradley's local country club connections to appease a furious shipping magnate in Shanghai who did not care about American social status in the slightest. My father had handed the steering wheel of a massive and speeding semi-truck to a young woman who did not even know how to put the key in the ignition, and they were currently flying right off a financial cliff. My father and sister had arrogantly believed that leadership was just a fancy title printed on a business card. They thought it was just sitting at the head of the table at expensive dinners and taking all the credit for record-breaking financial quarters. They were about to learn the most painful and devastating lesson in corporate survival. Leadership is not the shiny crown you wear on your head. It is the crushing weight you can carry on your shoulders when the foundation of the building starts to crack. At 10:30 in the morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was not the IT department begging for help. It was not a panicked freight manager or a deeply angry international vendor demanding unpaid money. The caller ID displayed my father's personal cell phone number. I let it ring 3 full times, savoring the absolute power of making him wait for me. Then I calmly swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy and frantic breathing on the other end of the line. Claire. His voice was completely stripped of its usual smooth and authoritative charm. It was tight and raw and shaking with barely suppressed rage. Where in the world are you right now? I am sitting at home, Richard, I said casually, taking another slow sip of my coffee. It had gone slightly cold, but I did not mind at all. I am enjoying a very quiet and peaceful Monday morning. Get into your car right now and get down to this office, he demanded. The loud sound of shouting dispatchers and ringing telephones echoed chaotically in the background of his call. The entire software system is down. The vendors in Germany and China are threatening to permanently terminate our contracts. Chloe has been crying in her office trying to fix the software for 2 hours, and she cannot get past the security firewall you built. You need to come here immediately and type in your override codes. I let a long and heavy silence stretch across the phone line. I wanted him to truly feel the absolute void of my absence. I wanted the reality of his massive mistake to sink deep into his bones. I do not work for you anymore, Richard, I said quietly. I resigned on Friday night. I left my company keys on my dinner plate. If Chloe is the bright and new chief executive officer, she should be perfectly capable of managing a minor software glitch and a few angry vendors. That is exactly what you pay her that massive salary for, isn't it? Stop playing these childish games, Claire! He practically screamed into the receiver, losing whatever tiny shred of composure he had left. This is not funny anymore. We are literally losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every single hour you refuse to log in. You're intentionally sabotaging this family company because you threw a jealous tantrum over your sister getting a promotion. Your mother would be absolutely ashamed of you if she were alive to see this. I felt a brief spike of anger at him daring to mention my mother, but I pushed it down instantly. Emotion was a weakness I could no longer afford to show him. I am not sabotaging anything, I replied, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of emotion. I am simply not doing your work for you anymore. You wanted Chloe to wear the beautiful crown. Now she gets to deal with the guillotine. If you do not walk through these front doors in the next 20 minutes, my father threatened, his voice dropping into a vicious and ugly snarl. I will completely ruin your life. I will call our corporate attorneys right now, and I will sue you for professional abandonment. I will sue you for intentional destruction of company property and corporate sabotage. I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years until you are completely bankrupt and living on the street. You will never work in the logistics industry ever again. Do you hear me, Claire? I will destroy you. I smiled. It was a genuine and terrifying smile that he could not physically see, but I knew deep down that he could feel the coldness of it radiating through the phone. I thought about the highly secure and encrypted hard drive currently sitting safely locked inside my fireproof home safe. The drive containing every single hidden financial ledger, every massive offshore wire transfer, every fraudulent receipt for his Mediterranean yacht charters, and Chloe's sprawling McMansion. He really wanted to threaten me with corporate lawyers. He had absolutely no idea that he was bringing a cheap pocket knife to a full-scale nuclear war. Sue me, Richard, I whispered softly, leaning forward on my couch. Please call your expensive lawyers today. File the emergency injunction against me. Open up the company books to a full legal discovery process. Let us show the judge exactly where all the profit money from the Asian contracts has been secretly going for the last 8 years. Let us show the federal auditors exactly how you managed to pay off the mortgage for Chloe's luxury house while claiming the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. I am absolutely sure the Internal Revenue Service would love to see the real accounting records instead of the fake ones you show the board. The phone line went completely and utterly dead silent. The chaotic background noise of the panicked office dispatch floor seemed to entirely fade away into nothingness. I could actually hear his breath catch sharply in his throat. He knew. In that single and frozen second of time, my father finally realized that I had seen the hidden ledger on the backup server. He realized that the quiet and obedient daughter he had ruthlessly exploited for 8 long years was currently holding the digital detonator to his entire criminal empire. Claire, he stammered, the burning rage in his voice entirely replaced by sudden and suffocating panic. Claire, wait a minute. What are you talking about? What did you see on the server? I did not let him finish his desperate sentence. I pulled the phone away from my ear and calmly tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected with a sharp and final click, establishing a hard and impenetrable boundary. I placed the phone gently back down onto the glass coffee table, stood up from the couch, and walked back into my kitchen to pour myself a second cup of coffee. The total collapse of Sterling Global had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy watching every single second of the fall. The crisp morning air of the city felt remarkably clean as I stepped out of my cab on Tuesday. The weekend storm had finally passed, leaving behind a bright and merciless sunlight that reflected sharply off the towering glass skyscrapers. I adjusted the strap of my heavy leather tote bag against my shoulder. Resting safely at the bottom of that bag was the military-grade encrypted solid-state drive I had secured on Saturday morning. The drive contained every single hidden ledger, every fraudulent offshore wire transfer, and every forged expense report my father and sister had created over the past 8 years. I was not walking into this massive building to seek emotional comfort or to cry about a broken family. I was walking into the most feared corporate litigation firm in the state to hire an absolute mercenary. The law offices of Cole and Associates occupied the entire top floor of a massive commercial high-rise. I swiped my temporary guest pass and took the private elevator up. When the heavy steel doors opened, I was greeted by an expansive reception area decorated in dark mahogany and polished marble. It was a space specifically designed to intimidate opponents and reassure wealthy clients. I gave my name to the receptionist and was immediately escorted down a long and quiet hallway to a corner conference room. Waiting for me inside were 2 people who would become the architects of my absolute vengeance. Evelyn Cole was a senior partner and a legendary corporate litigator. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and had the kind of calm, predatory gaze that made opposing counsel sweat before a trial even began. Sitting beside her was a senior forensic accountant named Benjamin Hayes. Benjamin looked exactly like a man who spent his entire professional life hunting down missing money in offshore tax havens. He had thick glasses, a serious expression, and a completely barren legal pad resting on the glass table in front of him. I took a seat across from them. I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful introductions. I reached into my bag, pulled out the encrypted drive, and slid it across the smooth glass surface of the table. I need you to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar international logistics company, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any hesitation. I need you to prove systematic embezzlement, wire fraud, and corporate theft. And I need to do it without the current chief executive officer or the chairman of the board knowing anything until the exact moment the trap snaps completely shut on their necks. Evelyn Cole did not smile, but a spark of deep professional interest ignited in her dark eyes. She picked up the small drive and handed it to Benjamin. "Let us see exactly what kind of war you're asking us to wage," she said softly. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that conference room while Benjamin systematically decrypted the drive and transferred the massive files onto his secure, isolated network. The silence in the room was heavy and thick, only broken by the rapid clicking of his keyboard and the soft hum of the air conditioning unit. I watched the dual monitors on the wall as the hidden financial ledgers populated the screens. Rows and rows of undeniable numbers appeared. the massive incoming revenue streams from the international contracts I had personally negotiated, standing in stark contrast to the millions of dollars being quietly siphoned away into private shell companies belonging to my father and my sister. Benjamin adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the screen. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up public property records and cross-referencing the hidden offshore routing numbers. "This is incredibly brazen," he murmured almost to himself. "Your father was not simply skimming profits off the top of the company. He was aggressively draining the primary operating capital to fund personal luxury real estate acquisitions. The shell company registered to his name is holding the deed to a massive waterfront estate in Florida. The entity registered to your sister is currently paying a massive monthly mortgage on a luxury property in the suburbs. They were floating the entire global logistics operation on a highly dangerous wave of unpaid vendor debt to mask the cash flow deficit." I sat perfectly still, listening to the clinical validation of my absolute nightmare. They had stolen my entire youth. They had drained my vibrant energy and destroyed my marriage to fund their grotesque vanity. They treated my brilliance and my sacrifice as a bottomless well they could draw from whenever they wanted. Evelyn Cole flipped through a printed copy of the standard vendor contracts I had provided. Her sharp eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs detailing the massive international supply chain routes. "Claire," she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet room, "these specific logistics contracts deal with moving heavy materials for large-scale infrastructure projects. We are talking about massive shipments of structural steel for European transit systems and specialized engineering components from Asia. These contracts are the lifeblood of Sterling Global. They represent over 70% of the total company revenue. But the signature on the primary vendor agreements does not belong to your father." I nodded slowly, the heavy weight of the past 8 years pressing down on my chest. When we decided to aggressively expand our logistics network into the international market, my father realized the massive corporate tax implications of bringing that much foreign revenue directly into a struggling domestic company. He panicked. To avoid pushing Sterling Global into a higher tax bracket and facing intense federal audits, he demanded that I set up an independent personal limited liability company. He told me it was a standard industry loophole. He forced me to register the independent entity entirely under my own name, using my own social security number and my own residential address. I was young. I was desperate for his approval, and I genuinely believed his narrative that we were struggling to survive. Evelyn stopped completely still. She set the printed contract down on the glass table. She looked at me with an expression of absolute profound realization. A slow and terrifying smile began to spread across her face. It was the smile of a wolf that had just found the keys to the slaughterhouse. "Claire," she said, her voice dropping into a low and thrilling whisper, "do you understand what your father actually did when he forced you to sign those documents under your own personal business entity?" I looked at her, waiting for the legal translation of my past actions. "He was trying to hide the money from the Internal Revenue Service," Evelyn explained, her eyes shining with aggressive legal anticipation. "But in his arrogant rush to avoid corporate taxes, he made a fatal, uncorrectable blunder. Sterling Global does not legally own a single one of these international contracts. Your father does not own the European supply routes for the large-scale infrastructure projects. Your sister does not own the Asian manufacturing partnerships. Because you signed these binding agreements under your personal name, you are the sole legal proprietor of those relationships. Sterling Global is merely acting as a third-party domestic distributor. You do not just work for the company, Claire. You legally own the entire international empire." The words hit me with the force of a freight train. The air rushed out of my lungs. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the massive digital screens displaying the global shipping routes. I thought about the grueling 80-hour work weeks. I had built complex multi-step digital workflows from absolute scratch to automate the entire European supply chain. My multi-step workflows integrated customs clearance algorithms and real-time satellite tracking for thousands of tons of freight. I had spent countless sleepless nights designing those exact digital pathways. And I thought about the profound language barriers I had to overcome to secure those specific contracts. When the European vendors refused to communicate effectively in English, I had sacrificed my precious free time to become completely fluent in Italian and German. I flew to Milan and Munich, sitting in smoke-filled boardrooms, negotiating massive freight discounts in their native tongues. When I recognized that the Asian market was the absolute strategic future of our industry, I had spent 2 agonizing years studying late into the night. I mastered the language because I knew Mandarin is the language of the future. I used that specific fluency to secure the exclusive manufacturing contracts in Shanghai that saved Sterling Global from total collapse. I had done all the heavy lifting. I had built the workflows. I had mastered the languages. I had forged the relationships. And my father, in his endless greed to avoid paying taxes, had legally handed me the permanent ownership of every single thing I had built. They do not own the clients, I whispered, the cold and calculating realization washing over my entire body. They do not own the vendors. Without my workflows and my contracts, they are just a domestic dispatch center with no actual freight to move. Exactly, Benjamin said, tapping his pen against the legal pad. And because they have been actively skimming millions of dollars off the top of the revenue generated by your personal business entity. They have not just committed corporate fraud against Sterling Global, they have committed direct wire fraud and embezzlement against you personally as an independent business owner. The heartbreak I had felt on Friday night at the country club was completely gone now. The crushing weight of my father raising his champagne glass and naming my incompetent sister as the chief executive officer evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, and perfectly focused rage. I was no longer the discarded, obedient daughter. I was a fully armed corporate adversary holding a loaded weapon pointed directly at their stolen throne. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass table. "Here is exactly what we are going to do," she said, her voice pulsing with authoritative energy. "We are going to weaponize this massive legal blunder. We are going to silently and meticulously draft the formal legal notices required to officially sever your personal company from any and all business affiliations with Sterling Global. We will cite their failure to pay the outstanding vendor invoices as a material breach of fiduciary duty. But we are not going to send these notices today. We are not going to announce your departure or threaten them with lawsuits. We are going to let them continue to panic." I nodded, understanding the brutal elegance of this silent strategy. If we warned them now, my father would attempt to hide the remaining offshore assets. He would use his country club connections to secure emergency bridge loans. We had to let the crisis escalate naturally. We had to let my sister completely fail at managing the software crashes and the angry international vendors. We had to let the pressure build until the pipes burst. "I want to launch my own competing logistics firm," I stated firmly, looking directly into Evelyn's eyes. "I have the automated workflows. I have the vendor trust. I speak the necessary languages. I want to seamlessly transition every single international client directly into a new corporate entity that I control entirely. I want to pull the foundation right out from under Sterling Global and watch the entire building collapse on top of them." Evelyn Cole actually laughed. It was a sharp and victorious sound that echoed loudly in the conference room. "I can absolutely facilitate that, Claire. We will establish your new corporate structure by the end of the week. We will prepare the injunctions to freeze your father's offshore accounts the moment the separation is finalized. By the time they realize you are not coming back to save them, they will be staring down the barrel of a massive federal audit and the total legal liquidation of their company." For the next 2 hours, we worked in absolute focused silence. Benjamin continued to trace the stolen funds, mapping out the exact financial pathways we would soon block. Evelyn drafted the complex severance documents, preparing the legal trap with meticulous and lethal precision. I sat beside them, feeling a profound sense of empowerment coursing through my veins. I reviewed the lists of my primary contacts in Shanghai, Munich, and Rome. I knew exactly what I would say to them when the time came. I knew they would follow me because business is ultimately built on competence and trust, not on stolen titles or unearned arrogance. When the meeting finally concluded, I stood up and shook hands with both of them. I signed the heavy retainer agreement, officially engaging their services for the war ahead. I packed the encrypted drive back into my leather tote bag. The bag felt much lighter now. The burden of carrying my family's toxic expectations had been entirely lifted, replaced by the thrilling weight of absolute control. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back into the bright city sunlight. The streets buzzed with energy around me. My phone was currently turned off, resting quietly in my pocket, protecting me from the desperate, panicked calls I knew my father and sister were frantically making. They thought they had successfully pushed me into the shadows so Chloe could shine in the spotlight. They completely forgot that the shadows are exactly where you go to silently load your weapons and prepare for the ultimate strike. The board members and the investors were going to find out the truth very soon. The total destruction of Sterling Global was no longer just a possibility. It was a legally guaranteed certainty. By Wednesday morning, the crushing weight of reality had finally begun to suffocate the executive floor of Sterling Global. I was sitting at my kitchen island, enjoying a quiet breakfast and watching the morning news when my cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed the name of Thomas, our domestic freight manager. I had ignored his calls on Monday, knowing he was just a pawn in my father's frantic attempts to reach me. But this time he was calling from his personal cell phone before normal office hours. I picked up the device and answered, listening to the sound of a man who was watching a massive ship sink rapidly beneath his feet. "Claire, please do not hang up on me," Thomas whispered. His voice was incredibly tight, echoing slightly as if he had locked himself inside a supply closet to make the call. "I am not calling to ask you to come back. I already know you are gone for good, and honestly, I do not blame you. I am calling because I thought you needed to know what your sister just did." I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaning back against the wooden kitchen stool. "What did the chief executive officer do now, Thomas?" "She took the corporate jet to Seattle last night," Thomas said, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "She flew out there with her husband Bradley to meet personally with Robert Henderson." I actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Robert Henderson was the founder and absolute dictator of Henderson Infrastructure. They were Sterling Global's largest domestic client, representing nearly 30% of our total domestic revenue. Henderson was currently building the massive Pacific Transit Corridor, a multi-billion-dollar light rail project that required thousands of tons of specialized structural steel to be shipped directly from Shanghai to the Seattle ports on a razor-thin schedule. I had personally managed the Henderson account for 4 years. Robert Henderson was a gritty, self-made 60-year-old construction titan who wore steel-toed boots to board meetings and absolutely despised corporate fluff. He only cared about strict deadlines, pinpoint accuracy, and people who knew exactly what they were doing, because every hour of delayed steel delivery cost his construction crews tens of thousands of dollars in wasted labor. The Shanghai shipments are currently frozen at the port because the vendor invoices have not been paid, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Without my automated routing workflows, those containers are not moving anywhere. Robert Henderson must be losing his mind. "He is," Thomas confirmed, sounding completely exhausted. "Henderson called the main office yesterday afternoon, screaming at the top of his lungs about the frozen steel. He demanded to speak to you." Chloe intercepted the call. She actually told him to calm down and said she would fly out to take him to a nice dinner to smooth things over. "Claire," she brought glossy corporate brochures. "She thinks she can charm Robert Henderson with a steak dinner and some marketing buzzwords." I thanked Thomas for his loyalty and ended the call, setting the phone down on the cold granite counter. I did not feel panic. I felt a deep and terrifying sense of anticipation. My sister was a woman who had spent her entire 28 years believing that a pretty smile, an expensive designer dress, and a country club membership could open any door and solve any problem. My father had shielded her from the brutal, unforgiving reality of actual business wrapping her in a protective bubble of unearned privilege. Now, she was walking completely unarmed into a room with a man who chewed up incompetent executives for sport. The details of that catastrophic meeting in Seattle trickled down to me later that afternoon through my old contacts in the dispatch department who were frantically watching the fallout on their screens. It was a disaster of truly cinematic proportions. Chloe had arrived at the Henderson Infrastructure headquarters wearing a stunning navy blue Chanel suit, her hair perfectly blown out, looking every inch the wealthy socialite she actually was. She brought Bradley with her, assuming his background as a local real estate agent and his golf handicap would somehow impress a man who built suspension bridges. They were escorted into a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the active Seattle shipyards. Robert Henderson did not offer them coffee. He did not ask about their flight. He dropped a massive stack of delayed shipping manifests directly onto the center of the heavy oak table and demanded to know exactly when the steel from Shanghai would clear the United States customs port. My sister sat down at the table and offered him a brilliant, rehearsed smile. Robert, she reportedly said, using his first name immediately, which I knew he absolutely hated. Let us not get bogged down in the minor operational details today. My father has just promoted me to Chief Executive Officer, and I flew out here to talk about the dynamic synergy between our two companies. We want to pivot our corporate culture to better align with your future growth. Henderson stared at her, completely baffled by the sheer magnitude of her ignorance. He tapped a thick, calloused finger against the shipping manifests. I do not care about your corporate culture, little girl, he growled. I care about the 4,000 tons of structural steel currently sitting locked in a holding bay. What is the specific tariff offset code holding up the release? And what is your contingency routing algorithm to get it on my trucks by midnight tonight? Chloe froze. The blood drained completely out of her face. She had absolutely no idea what a tariff offset code was. She did not know what a routing algorithm looked like because she had never bothered to look at the multi-step workflows I had painstakingly built. She tried to deflect, falling back on the only language she understood. Well, our logistics team is currently running a full diagnostic on those files, she stammered. But Bradley and I would love to take you over to the country club for dinner to discuss expanding our partnership. Bradley plays with some of the best private equity managers on the West Coast. Bradley flashed a smug, confident smile, reaching across the table to offer Henderson a firm handshake. We can definitely get you access to the private greens, Robert. Let the computer guys handle the shipping codes. Let us talk about the big picture. Robert Henderson did not take Bradley's hand. Instead, his face turned a deep and dangerous shade of red. He was a man who had built a billion-dollar empire with his own bare hands, and he realized in that exact moment that Richard Sterling had sent a completely incompetent, arrogant child to handle a crisis that was currently threatening his most important construction project. I do not play golf, Henderson said, his voice dropping into a low, furious gravel that made the glass walls of the conference room vibrate. And I do not do business with trust fund children who do not know the difference between a supply chain and a country club menu. He stood up, reached across the table, and literally tore the massive Sterling Global extension contract in half, right in front of their faces. You tell your father that this partnership is permanently terminated, effective immediately. Henderson shouted, pointing directly at the door. I will have my lawyers draft the breach of contract lawsuit by the end of the week. Now get out of my building before I have security throw you out. Chloe actually started crying. The golden child who had never been told no in her entire pampered life broke down in tears of profound humiliation. She fled the conference room with Bradley trailing awkwardly behind her, their glossy corporate brochures left completely abandoned on the table. In less than 10 minutes, Chloe had managed to permanently incinerate 30% of Sterling Global's total domestic revenue. I sat in my apartment, visualizing the absolute devastation of that moment. My sister had finally stepped out of the protective shadows of my relentless hard work, and the blinding sunlight of reality had burned her to ash instantly. She could not charm her way out of a broken supply chain. She could not use my father's money to buy the respect of a man who only valued raw competence. The fake throne my father had built for her was currently collapsing under her feet. By Thursday morning, the financial shockwave of the lost Henderson contract had hit the Sterling Global accounting department like a catastrophic earthquake. The company's stock valuation began to tank immediately. Investors were calling the main office, demanding answers. The massive bridge loans my father was desperately trying to secure to pay off the angry European vendors were suddenly denied by the banks because the primary domestic revenue stream had just evaporated into thin air. At 10 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone rang. It was my father. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear, but I remained entirely silent. I wanted to hear exactly how he was going to process the undeniable reality of his favored daughter's staggering incompetence. I expected him to be panicked. I expected him to beg me to come back and call Robert Henderson to salvage the account. I even expected a half-hearted, desperate apology. I was completely wrong. Claire, my father screamed into the receiver. His voice was completely unhinged, raw and tearing at the edges with absolute panic. What did you do? What did you do to the primary software servers before you walked out of this building on Friday night? I frowned, genuinely confused by the sheer volume of his rage. I did not touch the servers, Richard. I simply went home. Stop lying to me, he roared, the sound of a fist slamming violently against a heavy wooden desk echoing through the phone. Chloe called me from Seattle in tears. She told me everything. She was completely prepared for that meeting with Henderson. She had all the right data ready to present to him, but when she tried to access the contingency routing files remotely, your access codes blocked her out entirely. You intentionally deleted the tariff offset algorithms so she would look stupid in front of the client. You deliberately sabotaged her presentation because you are a jealous, bitter woman. I sat perfectly still on my couch, the breath completely leaving my lungs as the sheer depth of their shared delusion finally settled over me. Chloe had not taken responsibility for her catastrophic failure. Of course she had not. She was completely incapable of looking in the mirror and admitting that she was unqualified. Instead, she had called our father, crying those same manipulative tears she had used since childhood, and spun a wildly fabricated story to protect her fragile ego. She claimed she knew exactly how to fix the Shanghai steel crisis, but claimed I had maliciously planted a virus in the system to destroy her files. And the most terrifying part was that my father genuinely believed her. He had to believe her, because if he admitted that Chloe was incompetent, he would have to admit that he had made a fatal, deeply arrogant mistake by making her the chief executive officer. He would rather watch his entire life's work burn to the ground than admit he was wrong about his golden child. "You are sick, Claire," my father hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic, desperate hatred. "You are going to federal prison for corporate sabotage. I am calling the federal authorities today. We lost the Henderson contract because you intentionally destroyed company property to ruin your own sister's promotion. You are a disgusting, vindictive person, and I am going to make sure you spend the rest of your life paying for what you did to this family." I did not scream back at him. I did not try to defend myself against the insane, absolutely baseless accusation. I simply felt a cold, sharp, and profound clarity wash over every single nerve in my body. They were not just bad business partners. They were cornered, desperate animals who would gladly throw me in a prison cell to avoid facing the consequences of their own massive theft and stupidity. I am not the one hiding millions of dollars in stolen offshore accounts. Richard, I said, my voice dropping into a whisper, so quiet and so cold it practically froze the air in my living room. I am not the one who forced my daughter to sign the European logistics contracts under her own personal name to avoid corporate taxes. I did not sabotage your system. I just stopped doing your jobs for you, and you are drowning because neither of you knows how to swim. My father stopped breathing on the other end of the line. The absolute mention of the offshore accounts and the personal contracts hit him like a physical blow to the chest, silencing his unhinged screaming instantly. "Tell Chloe I hope she enjoyed her flight on the corporate jet." I continued, keeping my tone completely flat and clinical, because the federal auditors from the Internal Revenue Service are going to be very interested in exactly how she paid for the fuel. I hung up the phone before he could utter a single word in response. I did not block his number this time. I wanted his phone to be fully active when my lawyer, Evelyn Cole, finally dropped the legal hammer and formally severed my personal company from their failing operation. They wanted to play a game of corporate blame to protect their fragile egos. They had absolutely no idea that the real war had already been won in the shadows, and I was just waiting for the exact perfect moment to walk into their boardroom and foreclose on their entire stolen lives. The drive to my cousin Emma's wedding took exactly 45 minutes, but it felt like marching toward a predetermined execution. 2 weeks had passed since I dropped my company keys onto a plate of prime rib and walked out of the country club, leaving my father and sister staring after me. 2 weeks of silence from my end, spent entirely in the sterile, secure conference room of a corporate lawyer, meticulously cataloging years of massive financial fraud. But Richard and Chloe had not been silent. While I was building an impenetrable fortress of legal defense, they had been running a masterclass in psychological warfare. They had spent every hour since my resignation working the family phone tree, systematically poisoning the well. I knew what I was walking into the moment I pulled my car into the gravel lot of the sprawling botanical garden venue. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive catering and blooming jasmine, but my stomach twisted with a familiar, heavy dread. A smear campaign is a fascinating and terrifying thing to witness from the outside. It operates on the fundamental assumption that a father would never lie about his own daughter and that a younger sister is always innocent. They had painted me to the extended family as a jealous, bitter woman who was actively trying to ruin her sister's success. The narrative they spun was breathtaking in its audacity. According to the whispers I had already heard through a sympathetic cousin, I was completely unhinged. I was so consumed by petty sibling rivalry over being passed over for the CEO title that I was willing to burn down our family's legacy just to spite Chloe. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing a stray piece of hair. I wore a tailored sapphire dress that felt more like armor than evening wear. I took a deep breath, plastered a neutral expression on my face, and stepped out of the car. Running away is what guilty people do, and I had absolutely nothing to be guilty about. The reception hall was housed inside a massive glass conservatory dripping with fairy lights and overflowing with white orchids. A string quartet played softly in the corner, blending with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. But the moment my heels clicked against the marble floor, the atmosphere in the room perceptibly shifted. It started as a subtle ripple, a glance quickly diverted, a conversation suddenly dropping in volume as I walked past a cocktail table, a tight, forced smile from a second cousin who usually greeted me with a massive, crushing hug. The lies had taken root beautifully. I made my way to the bar, ordering a club soda with lime, keeping my posture perfectly straight. As I waited for the bartender, I caught the reflection of my family in the antique mirror behind the liquor bottles. There was Chloe standing near the centerpiece ice sculpture, wearing a designer gown paid for by the funds she had skimmed from my grueling labor. She was dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, playing the devastated victim to a captive audience of our great aunts. My father stood beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, looking every bit the weary patriarch, trying to hold his fractured family together against the assault of an unstable daughter. It was an incredible performance. If I had not seen the hidden ledgers with my own two eyes, if I had not decrypted the offshore bank routing numbers myself, I might have actually felt sorry for them. I took my drink and moved toward the perimeter of the room, preferring to observe the dynamics before engaging. I watched as the whispers followed me like a shadow. Relatives I had known my entire life, people whose mortgages my father had likely helped pay, looked at me with a mixture of pity and outright disgust. I had spent 8 years missing their birthdays, skipping their holiday parties, and working 80-hour weeks to keep the very company afloat that funded this entire family's lavish lifestyle. And yet, it took only one carefully crafted lie from my father for them to discard me entirely. That is the insidious nature of toxic family loyalty. My extended family did not want the truth. They wanted the comfortable illusion that Richard Sterling was a benevolent provider and that I was simply a hysterical, jealous woman. The truth would require them to ask hard questions about where the family money was actually coming from. The truth would require them to look closely at the man signing their occasional loan checks. It was infinitely easier to cast me out. The cocktail hour was winding down, and guests were beginning to find their seats for dinner when the trap finally snapped shut. I was standing near a display of ferns, admiring the glass architecture, when I found myself suddenly surrounded. It was not a casual bumping of shoulders. It was a highly coordinated maneuver. Aunt Susan, my father's older sister, stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path to the dining area. Uncle Robert flanked my left side and Aunt Martha moved in on my right. They cornered me like I was a dangerous animal that needed to be corralled back into a cage. Susan's face was pinched, her lips pressed into a thin, deeply disappointed line. She was a woman who had never worked a day in her corporate life, having married into generational wealth, but she carried herself with the supreme authority of a judge, handing down a sentence. "We need to talk about this ridiculous tantrum you're throwing." Susan said, her voice a harsh, serrated whisper designed not to attract the attention of the non-family wedding guests. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my club soda. "I am not throwing a tantrum, Susan. I simply resigned from a job." "Resigned?" Uncle Robert scoffed, crossing his arms over his tuxedo chest, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. You abandoned your father. You abandoned your sister right when she needed your support the most. Do you have any idea how much stress you have caused that poor girl? She is supposed to be celebrating her hard-earned promotion, and instead, she's crying herself to sleep because her own flesh and blood is trying to sabotage her. I looked at Robert, the exact same Robert who had called me 6 months ago, practically begging for a logistics position for his deeply incompetent son, a job I had provided out of sheer family obligation, and then spent months covering up his mistakes. The hypocrisy in the air was so thick, I could practically taste it. I have not sabotaged anyone, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of emotion. Chloe is the CEO now. She's more than welcome to run the entire global supply chain however she sees fit. I am simply moving on with my own career. Stop lying to us, Claire, Aunt Martha hissed, stepping uncomfortably close, the smell of her expensive perfume overwhelming my senses. We know exactly what you did. Richard told us everything. He told us how you intentionally locked them out of the overseas accounts. He told us how you are actively trying to steal the Asian contracts out of pure spite just because you did not get the fancy title. They were confronting me, leaning in with aggressive postures, demanding that I apologize to my father and go back to work. You need to swallow your pride immediately, Susan demanded, jabbing a manicured finger in the direction of my chest. You are tearing this family apart over nothing but ego. Your father is beside himself with worry. He built that company from the ground up for all of us for our future, and you are acting like a spoiled, petulant child. You are going to march over to their table right now. You are going to apologize to your father and your sister for this display, and you are going to go back to the office on Monday morning and fix the catastrophic mess you created. The psychological pressure they were applying was immense, a heavy, suffocating blanket of collective family shame. This is exactly how toxic systems maintain their power. They use guilt duty and the very real threat of total social ostracization to force the dissenting member back into compliance. They do not care about your pain, your burnout, or your side of the story. They only care about maintaining the comfortable status quo that benefits them. For 29 years of my life, this exact tactic would have worked flawlessly. I would have crumbled under the crushing weight of their collective disappointment. I would have internalized the blame, doubted my own perception of reality, and apologized profusely, just to make the deeply uncomfortable confrontation stop. I would have sacrificed my own sanity and future on the altar of family peace. But I was not that girl anymore. The woman standing in that botanical garden surrounded by hostile relatives was fundamentally different. I didn't scream at them. I didn't cry or beg them to believe my side of the story. I didn't throw my drink in Susan's face or make a dramatic, tearful scene that would ruin my cousin's wedding reception. I stayed eerily calm. I let the silence stretch between us. In fact, the calmer and more still I became, the more visibly agitated they seemed to get. My absolute silence was a mirror reflecting their own irrational panic back at them, and they despised it. I looked at Susan's furious, demanding face. I looked at Robert's self-righteous, puffed-up posture. I looked at Martha's condemning glare. And then, without saying a single word in my defense, I simply smiled. It was not a defensive smile or a polite, placating smile. It was a cold, deep, terrifyingly knowing smile. It was the smile of someone who is holding a ticking time bomb of evidence. As they glared at me, waiting for me to break, I thought about the encrypted hard drive currently sitting safely in my lawyer's fireproof vault. I thought about the hundreds of forged expense reports, the illegally routed offshore accounts, the millions of dollars systematically siphoned from the company by the very people these aunts and uncles were currently defending with their lives. I knew with absolute crystal clarity that in a matter of mere weeks, the grand illusion of Richard Sterling's empire was going to violently and publicly shatter. I knew that the federal courts were going to freeze their assets, that the sprawling McMansions would be foreclosed on by the banks, and that the undeniable truth of who the real thieves were would become a matter of permanent public record. I was holding every single card in the deck, and they were aggressively playing a losing hand built entirely on lies. "Why are you smiling?" Susan demanded, her voice faltering for a fraction of a second, unsettled by my lack of submission. "There is absolutely nothing funny about this situation. You are ruining your sister's life and breaking your father's heart. I took one final refreshing sip of my drink, savoring the cold bite of the lime, and gracefully handed the empty glass to a passing waiter who was weaving through the crowd with a tray of appetizers. I am not going to apologize. Susan, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy floral-scented air with absolute unshakable clarity. And I'm never going back to Sterling Global. You can all choose to believe whatever fabricated story Richard and Chloe have fed you this week. You can paint me as the villain of this family. You can tell the entire room that I'm a bitter, jealous monster trying to tear down my sister. It truly, deeply does not matter to me anymore. But family comes first, Martha cried out, clutching her expensive pearl necklace as if I had just spoken a profound blasphemy in a church. We take care of each other. Family does come first, Martha. I agreed softly, looking her dead in the eye, which is exactly why I spent my entire 20s sacrificing my physical health, my mental well-being, and my marriage to keep that company alive, while Chloe spent her days vacationing in St. Bart's and complaining about the organic coffee. But loyalty is a two-way street, and my street is officially closed. I didn't try to explain the massive wire fraud. I didn't try to defend myself against their baseless accusations of sabotage. Explaining would have meant that I still valued their opinion, and I had just realized with a profound, rushing sense of liberation that I truly did not care what they thought of me anymore. Let them believe the smear campaign. Let them coddle and comfort Chloe. Let them worship my father as a saint. It would only make the impending legal explosion that much more devastating when the fallout finally rained down on their heads. I smiled at them one last time, a genuine smile of pure, unadulterated freedom that seemed to confuse them more than anger ever could. "Enjoy the prime rib, Susan," I said, cheerfully smoothing the front of my dress. "I hear the catering company is excellent this year." I stepped gracefully around them, leaving my aunt and uncle standing entirely speechless in a tight cluster of white orchids, their mouths slightly open in shock. I walked into the main dining hall, found my assigned seat at a table, deliberately placed far away from the bridal party, and sat down. I watched my father and sister across the room still actively working the crowd, still playing the tragic victims of my supposed jealousy. I didn't feel a single shred of guilt. I didn't feel a trace of anger or resentment. I just felt the quiet, steady, rhythmic ticking of the truth in my chest, counting down to the exact moment it would blow their entire world apart. Tuesday morning arrived with a sharp, aggressive knock on my front door. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring my first cup of coffee, and finally starting to enjoy the quiet peace of a life without toxic family drama. The morning sun was bright, and the neighborhood was perfectly still. But that knock carried a heavy, demanding rhythm that immediately made my stomach tighten. It was the kind of knock that promised bad news. I set my mug down and walked to the entryway, wiping my hands on a dish towel. When I opened the door, I found a man in a rumpled grey jacket holding a thick manila envelope. He asked me to confirm my identity. The moment the word yes left my lips, he shoved the heavy envelope directly against my chest, stated loudly that I had been officially served, and turned to walk away down my driveway without looking back. I stood on my porch for a long time, just staring at the return address printed in bold black ink. It was from the most expensive and aggressive corporate law firm in the city. This was the exact legal team my father retained whenever he wanted to completely crush a business rival. I carried the documents to my kitchen island and spread them out across the cool granite surface. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned the crisp white pages. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, meant to intimidate and overwhelm, but the accusations buried within the text were crystal clear and absolutely brutal. Richard had filed an emergency injunction and a massive frivolous lawsuit against me. The man who had raised me, who had gladly watched me sacrifice my 20s to save his failing business, was now formally claiming that I had stolen proprietary company property. The lawsuit spun a breathtakingly malicious narrative. Richard and his lawyers painted a picture of a deeply disturbed, disgruntled former employee who was out to destroy her family legacy out of pure petty spite. They claimed I had intentionally sabotaged the Sterling Global Logistics servers before abandoning my position. They accused me of violating a strict non-compete clause, a clause I knew for an absolute fact I had never signed because I was the one who drafted the employment contracts. But the most terrifying part of the document was tucked into the final few pages. Richard had successfully petitioned the court for an emergency temporary freeze on all my personal bank accounts. He told the judge that my newly formed business was funded by stolen corporate assets and that I was a flight risk who might hide the money offshore. The reality of what he had done hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was trying to suffocate me financially. He wanted to paralyze me so completely that I would be forced to crawl back to him and beg for mercy. To test the reality of the situation, I grabbed my purse and drove to the local grocery store. I walked through the aisles like a ghost, placing a few simple items in my basket. A loaf of bread, some milk, a carton of eggs. When I reached the checkout line, I slid my debit card into the machine. The screen glowed red and beeped loudly, announcing that the transaction was declined. I tried a different credit card. Declined again. The cashier looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance as the line of customers behind me began to shift uncomfortably. I had to leave the groceries on the belt and walk out of the store empty-handed. My cheeks burned with deep humiliation, but beneath the embarrassment, a profound and terrible anger began to boil. My father was willing to starve me out, just to protect the comfortable illusion he had built around my sister. I did not go home and cry. I did not call my father to scream or negotiate. Instead, I got back into my car and drove straight to the downtown office of my corporate attorney. The drive took 40 minutes, and I spent every single second of it channeling my fear into pure cold resolve. When I walked into the sleek glass-walled reception area, I bypassed the administrative assistant entirely and marched directly toward my lawyer's corner office. I dropped the massive stack of legal documents onto his mahogany desk. I expected him to look concerned. I expected him to tell me that we were in serious trouble and that fighting a frozen bank account would take months of grueling, expensive litigation. My lawyer picked up the injunction, slowly adjusting his reading glasses. He read through the first few pages, then flipped to the back to examine the judge's signature. He sat there in total silence for a full 5 minutes while I paced back and forth across his office carpet, my heart pounding against my ribs. Finally, he lowered the documents, took off his glasses, and did something that completely shocked me. He leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. It was the sharp, predatory smile of a professional fighter who had just noticed his opponent leave their chin wide open for a knockout punch. I stopped pacing and stared at him, asking him what could possibly be funny about my father freezing my entire life. My lawyer gestured for me to sit down. He explained that Richard had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his entire career. By filing a formal civil lawsuit against me, Richard thought he was displaying ultimate power. He thought he was trapping me in a corner. But in the legal world, filing a lawsuit automatically triggers a mechanism called legal discovery. Discovery is a mandatory process where both parties are legally compelled to share all evidence, communications, and financial records relevant to the case. My lawyer leaned across the desk and told me that by trying to prove I stole from Sterling Global, Richard had just legally opened the door for us to examine every single one of Sterling Global's financial ledgers. Richard had handed us the absolute legal right to expose his own criminal behavior. We did not have to play defense anymore. We were going to go on the offensive, and we were going to use the very weapon my father brought to the fight to dismantle his entire empire. We spent the next 3 days living in that office preparing our counterstrike. We ordered coffee and takeout food, working late into the night. We took the encrypted hard drive I had copied on my last day at the company and meticulously printed out every piece of evidence. Every forged expense report, every offshore wire transfer authorized by Chloe, every diverted payment that proved they had been systematically skimming millions of dollars from the Asian and European contracts. We organized the documents into massive black binders, cross-referencing dates and amounts with devastating precision. We were building a fortress of absolute, undeniable truth. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. The courthouse was an imposing granite building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. I walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored navy suit, my posture perfectly straight. I felt no fear. I felt nothing but the calm, steady rhythm of impending justice. Richard and Chloe were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Chloe wore a designer dress that cost more than my first car, looking incredibly bored as she filed her nails. My father wore his best custom-tailored suit, projecting the image of a weary, disappointed patriarch who was simply trying to discipline a rebellious child. When I walked down the aisle, he did not even look at me. He just whispered something to his high-priced lawyer and smirked. The judge entered the room, and the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us, sealing everyone inside. The judge was a stern woman with decades of experience written into the lines on her face. She immediately addressed my father's legal team, asking them to justify the emergency injunction and the freezing of my assets. Richard's lawyer stood up and delivered a dramatic, impassioned speech. He claimed I was a rogue employee who had stolen incredibly valuable corporate secrets, and that the court needed to protect Sterling Global from my malicious sabotage. He painted a masterful illusion holding up the non-compete clause and demanding that I be restrained from operating my new business. When he finished, the judge turned her attention to our table. She looked at me over her glasses and asked how we responded to these severe allegations. My lawyer stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not raise his voice. He did not put on a theatrical performance. He simply picked up the thickest black binder we had prepared and carried it to the center of the courtroom. He placed it directly in front of the judge with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. He calmly stated that we not only completely denied all allegations of theft, but we were submitting this forensic ledger into evidence to prove exactly why my father was so desperate to shut me down. My lawyer explained to the judge that the contracts in question were legally registered to my personal LLC because Richard had structured it that way years ago to avoid corporate taxes. I could not steal clients that I legally owned. But more importantly, my lawyer directed the judge to a specific tab in the binder. He explained that this ledger proved my father and sister were not victims of corporate theft. They were the perpetrators of a massive ongoing wire fraud scheme. He pointed out the specific routing numbers showing millions of dollars being siphoned directly from the company operations into private offshore accounts controlled by Richard and Chloe. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted violently. The smug expression completely vanished from Chloe's face. She dropped her nail file and sat bolt upright, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. My father's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He frantically grabbed his lawyer's arm, whispering aggressively, but his lawyer was staring at the documents the judge was reviewing, looking utterly horrified. The lawyer realized in that exact moment that his client had lied to him and led him directly into a trap. The judge spent 10 agonizing minutes reading through the financial records. The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. She flipped from page to page, tracing the forged signatures and the illicit wire transfers with her pen. When she finally looked up, her expression had transformed from neutral professional curiosity into cold judicial fury. She glared directly at my father. She stated that in her 25 years on the bench, she had rarely seen such a brazen misuse of the legal system to cover up criminal activity. She struck her gavel and immediately threw out the emergency injunction with prejudice. She ordered the immediate unfreezing of all my personal and business bank accounts, declaring my father's lawsuit to be entirely baseless and fraudulent. The relief washed over me like a warm rain, but the judge was not finished. She leaned forward and stated that because these documents had been formally entered into the legal record, she was statutorily obligated to report evidence of severe financial crimes. Right there in open court, she announced that she was forwarding the entire unredacted forensic ledger directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. My father physically slumped in his chair, looking like a balloon that had been violently punctured. He tried to speak to offer some kind of excuse or explanation, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Chloe buried her face in her hands, finally realizing that the luxury lifestyle she had stolen was about to be burned to the ground by federal auditors. The trap my father had so carefully laid for me had snapped shut on his own neck. He had brought a frivolous lawsuit to silence me, and in doing so, he had handed the authorities the exact roadmap they needed to dismantle his entire fraudulent empire. I stood up from the defense table as the court was dismissed. I gathered my purse and my coat, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I did not look back at the plaintiff's table. I did not need to see their panic or hear their desperate whispering. I walked out of those heavy wooden courtroom doors and stepped into the bright morning sunlight, holding the undeniable absolute proof of my own freedom. The legal war was over, and justice was finally coming for them. The morning of the final reckoning arrived with a cold, heavy rain that washed the streets of the city clean. I sat in the back of a black town car, watching the downtown skyline blur past the rain-slicked windows. For 8 long, grueling years, I had made this exact same commute to the Sterling Global headquarters. I used to make this drive with a heavy knot of anxiety sitting high in my chest, terrified of what daily crisis I would have to solve just to keep my father's company breathing for one more week. I used to spend these morning rides reviewing complex supply chain manifests and international shipping logs while drinking lukewarm coffee, praying that my relentless 80-hour work weeks would finally be enough to earn my father's respect. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace of mind, and ultimately my marriage to my ex-husband David, all on the altar of this company. But today, as the town car navigated the morning traffic, my hands were perfectly still, resting calmly in my lap. I wore a tailored navy blue suit that felt less like corporate attire and more like impenetrable armor. Beside me sat my corporate attorney Marcus, a man whose quiet professional demeanor hid a razor-sharp and utterly ruthless legal mind. On the leather seat between us rested a thick black binder. That binder contained the undeniable truth. It contained the meticulous records of every international contract I had personally secured, every automated workflow I had built from scratch, and every single dollar my father and sister had systematically siphoned away to fund their secret luxury lives. Today was the day the grand illusion would finally violently shatter. I knew exactly what was happening up on the 42nd floor of the Sterling building. My father Richard and my younger sister Chloe had called an emergency closed-door meeting with their primary investors and the lead representative from the corporate bank. Sterling Global was hemorrhaging money by the hour. Without my daily maintenance and the complex multi-step workflows I had personally authorized every single morning, their logistics software had completely collapsed. The overseas vendors in Asia and Europe were furious about unpaid invoices, and the supply lines were entirely frozen. Millions of dollars in freight were sitting idle at international ports. My father was desperate. He needed a massive immediate bailout loan to save the fraudulent empire he claimed he had built. I could picture him perfectly standing at the head of the long polished mahogany table, wearing his expensive custom-tailored suit, sweating under the harsh recessed lighting. I knew he would be using his deep, reassuring patriarch voice to charm the bankers, spinning a desperate web of lies about temporary software glitches and minor departmental restructuring issues. I knew Chloe would be sitting right beside him, wearing a designer outfit paid for with stolen funds, playing the role of the confident, newly appointed chief executive, while having absolutely no idea how to read the basic financial projections glowing on the screen behind her. They were actively trying to secure millions of dollars in new funding, based entirely on assets they did not even legally own. The town car pulled up to the towering glass entrance of the corporate building. I stepped out into the cold morning air, feeling a profound, rushing sense of clarity. We walked through the expansive marble lobby, our footsteps echoing against the stone, and stepped into the executive elevator. As the digital numbers above the door climbed higher and higher toward the 42nd floor, I felt 29 years of desperate, toxic family loyalty slipping away from my shoulders like a heavy, wet cloak. I was no longer the obedient, silent daughter trying to buy her father's love with endless sacrifice and free labor. I was a self-made businesswoman arriving to protect her own clients and her own future. When the elevator doors slid open onto the executive floor, the head receptionist looked up from her desk, and her jaw actually dropped. She reached for her phone instinctively to announce my arrival to the boardroom, but Marcus simply shook his head, and we walked straight past her wide-eyed stare. The massive double oak doors of the main boardroom stood at the very end of the carpeted hallway. I did not knock. I did not wait for an invitation or a pause in the conversation. I placed both hands firmly on the cool brass handles and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The scene inside the room was exactly as I had imagined, but the physical tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. My father was in the middle of an impassioned presentation, pointing a red laser pointer at a graph that showed completely fabricated positive revenue projections for the next quarter. Chloe was sitting near the lead bank representative, nodding along with a strained, panicked smile fixed on her face. There were 6 other primary investors seated around the massive table, all of them looking highly skeptical and impatient with their arms crossed. When the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the entire room froze in place. Every single head turned in my direction. My father's voice caught painfully in his throat, and the red dot of his laser pointer trembled wildly against the projection screen before disappearing entirely. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly pale and suddenly very old. Chloe gasped loudly and gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her manicured knuckles turning stark white. He choked out my name, his voice losing all of its usual commanding country club authority. He told me I had absolutely no legal right to be in this building. He said this was a highly confidential closed-door meeting with financial partners and ordered me to leave the room immediately or he would have the security guards remove me by force. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I did not show an ounce of fear, anger, or intimidation. I walked slowly and deliberately to the very center of the room, my lawyer stepping right in beside me to present a united, unshakable front. The investors watched in stunned silence as I approached the heavy table. I looked directly at the lead bank representative, a stern man I had actually negotiated with 3 years ago to secure the company's previous line of credit. I placed the massive black binder directly in front of him. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the polished wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. I told them I was not there to disrupt a legitimate business meeting. I explained, my voice carrying clearly and calmly across the expansive space, that I was there to correct a massive legal and financial misrepresentation before the bank committed to a fraudulent loan. My father lunged forward, slamming both of his hands down on the table. He shouted at the bankers not to listen to a single word. I said, his desperation completely breaking through his polished executive exterior. He claimed I was a deeply disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage this family company out of petty jealousy because I was rightfully passed over for the chief executive promotion. He even lied and said I was currently under federal legal investigation for theft. I turned to look at my father. He was gripping the edges of the podium so hard, his fingers looked bruised. For my entire life, I had bowed to that terrifying anger. Whenever he raised his voice or threatened me, I would immediately shrink back, internalize the blame, and apologize profusely, just trying to smooth things over to keep the fragile family peace intact. But looking at him right now, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical detachment. He was not an intimidating patriarch anymore. He was just a desperate small man caught in a massive web of his own arrogant lies. I turned my attention away from him and looked back at the bank representative and the primary investors. I addressed them as gentlemen, keeping my tone perfectly level and strictly professional. I reminded them they were being asked today to provide a massive injection of emergency capital to save Sterling Global from liquidation. They were being told that this company possessed highly lucrative exclusive shipping contracts in Asia and Europe, and that these international contracts would easily guarantee their return on investment. I placed my hand flat on top of the black binder and formally informed them that Sterling Global did not own a single one of those international clients. Chloe finally found her voice, though it was high-pitched and shaking with terror. She cried out, standing up quickly from her leather chair, pushing it back so hard it scraped against the floor. She screamed that I was lying out of pure spite to ruin her career and insisted they had the vendor contracts right there in their corporate files. Marcus stepped forward, then opening his sleek leather briefcase with a calm, practiced motion. He retrieved a thick stack of certified legal documents and began passing them down the long table for the investors to examine. He spoke with a smooth, carrying, undeniable authority, pointing out that if they reviewed the original vendor agreements, they would see those documents were never signed under the corporate entity of Sterling Global. Years ago, in a misguided attempt to shield this company from specific international corporate tax liabilities, my father had legally required me to sign every single overseas vendor contract under my own personal limited liability company. It was a clever tax evasion strategy at the time, but it created an undeniable legal reality that could not be undone. My lawyer made it perfectly clear that I legally owned every single Asian and European contract they were attempting to borrow millions of dollars against today. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and deafening. You could clearly hear the heavy rain lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The lead bank representative picked up the certified documents, adjusting his reading glasses. He flipped through the pages carefully, comparing the signatures, the dates, and the corporate seals. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text, and I saw the exact moment the devastating truth settled over him. He looked up at my father, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. He asked Richard in a dangerously low and quiet voice if this was true. He demanded to know if my father was standing in front of this committee, begging for a massive financial bailout using assets that belonged entirely to a completely separate legal entity. My father opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked at Chloe, who had sunk back into her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. He looked at Marcus, who was standing perfectly still, projecting total legal dominance. And finally, he looked at me. He expected me to look away. He expected me to show some kind of guilt or shame for humiliating him in such a public professional forum, but I stared right back at him with my head held high, completely unapologetic and entirely unafraid. I was not finished. The loss of the international contracts was more than enough to pull the bank funding, but I needed to ensure that this toxic, abusive empire could never be rebuilt to hurt anyone else again. I reached forward and opened the heavy black binder, flipping directly to a specific tab marked in bright red ink. I slid the open binder across the polished wood directly into the hands of the bank representative. I told the room that the ownership of the contracts was just the beginning, my voice dropping into a register of absolute finality. I strongly suggested they look at the forensic accounting ledger we had provided in that specific section. I explained they would find meticulous financial records spanning the last 8 years, showing exactly why Sterling Global was currently bankrupt and begging for cash. It was not because of a temporary software glitch or a minor supply chain restructuring issue. It was because millions of dollars had been systematically and illegally siphoned out of the corporate operating budget and transferred directly into private offshore accounts controlled exclusively by Richard and Chloe. Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp and half wail. She looked wildly around the room, as if searching for a hidden door she could run through to escape the crushing, suffocating weight of the truth. My father took a stumbling step backward, physically retreating from the mahogany table. He hissed that I had stolen those private records, his voice vibrating with raw panic and fury, claiming I hacked into their secure corporate servers. He tried to argue that it was stolen proprietary property and completely inadmissible in any setting. Marcus smiled a very cold, very sharp smile that offered absolutely no comfort. He calmly corrected my father, explaining that I did not steal anything but rather legally retained records of financial transactions that directly involved my own limited liability company. But far more importantly, Marcus pointed out those financial records were now a matter of permanent public judicial record. He turned to address the stunned board members, explaining that earlier this week, my father was foolish enough to file a frivolous civil lawsuit and an emergency legal injunction against me, attempting to maliciously freeze my personal bank accounts. By initiating a formal civil lawsuit, he legally opened his own company to mandatory financial discovery. I watched the bankers' faces turn from professional disgust to absolute undeniable horror. The lead investor closed the binder quickly and pushed it away from him as if the paper itself were physically contagious. Marcus continued delivering the final devastating blow to the room, stating we had submitted that exact forensic accounting ledger to the presiding judge yesterday morning to prove that the emergency injunction was entirely fraudulent. The judge not only threw out the baseless lawsuit immediately, but as a sworn officer of the court, she was statutorily obligated to report evidence of severe financial crimes. My lawyer formally notified the board of directors that as of yesterday afternoon, the Internal Revenue Service had officially opened a massive criminal audit into Sterling Global for systemic wire fraud and tax evasion. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and entirely chaotic. The lead bank representative stood up so fast, his heavy leather executive chair crashed backward onto the carpeted floor. He did not say a single word to my father or my sister. He simply grabbed his briefcase, shoved his important papers inside, snapped it shut, and walked directly out of the boardroom, his face flushed with intense anger. The primary investors were right behind him, standing up in unison, shouting over each other, demanding that their initial capital investments be returned immediately, threatening their own massive class action lawsuits against Richard and the entire executive board. Chloe stood up and tried to grab the arm of one of the departing investors, desperately trying to charm him, begging him to stay and listen to reason, but he brushed her off with a look of pure contempt. Within 60 seconds, the massive boardroom had completely emptied of anyone holding a checkbook or a line of credit. The emergency bailout was completely dead. The bank funding was permanently pulled. The logistics company was entirely over. It was a breathtaking cinematic collapse unfolding right before my eyes, and I felt a profound rushing sense of absolute justice washing over my entire body. I stood in the center of the quiet, ruined room, looking at the smoldering ashes of my father's grand legacy. Chloe was openly weeping now, her face buried deep in her hands, her expensive designer outfit suddenly looking ridiculous and entirely hollow. She was finally realizing that the stolen company money was permanently gone. The elite country club status was gone, and the federal tax authorities were coming to ruthlessly audit her lavish, unearned lifestyle. My father stood perfectly still at the head of the table, staring blankly at the empty chairs where his wealthy investors had just been sitting moments before. He looked completely shattered. A man who had spent his entire adult life valuing superficial appearances over actual substance, finally forced to look at the ugly, undeniable truth of his own criminal actions. For 8 long years, I had broken my own back to protect this man and his company. I had sacrificed my physical health, my emotional well-being, and my youth to keep his grand illusion alive, because I deeply believed that was what family was supposed to do. I truly thought that if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, he would eventually see my worth and love me for who I was. But staring at his defeated posture now, I finally understood the greatest and most painful lesson of my adult life. You can never earn the genuine love of people who view you solely as a disposable resource. You cannot sacrifice enough of your own soul to fill the endless black hole of their narcissistic entitlement. Toxic family members will take and take and take until you have absolutely nothing left to give, and then they will maliciously blame you for being empty. My father did not love me. He only loved what my relentless labor could do for his bank account and his ego. And the exact moment I stopped allowing him to exploit my loyalty, I immediately became his worst enemy. Setting a hard, unyielding boundary with abusive family members is not an act of selfish betrayal. It is a fundamental, necessary act of personal survival. I did not destroy Sterling Global today. I simply stopped providing the free, silent labor and the complicit loyalty that kept their fraudulent sinking ship afloat. They completely destroyed themselves the very moment they decided their financial greed was more important than protecting their own daughter. I reached out and closed the thick black binder. I picked it up, holding it against my side, feeling the solid, heavy weight of the truth in my hands. I did not offer my father or my sister an apology. I did not offer them a tearful explanation or a dramatic goodbye. There was absolutely nothing left to say to either of them ever again. I turned my back on my father and my weeping sister and walked straight out of the boardroom, my lawyer falling into perfect step beside me. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, past the empty reception desk, and stepped into the waiting elevator. When the metal doors slid shut, completely blocking out the Sterling Global corporate logo, for the very last time I closed my eyes and took a deep, clean breath. The heavy rain was still falling violently outside, washing the busy city streets below. But inside my heart, I felt nothing but bright, warm, radiant sunlight. The long, grueling war was officially over. I was finally completely, undeniably free. The silence that filled the executive boardroom after the lead investor walked out was not just quiet. It was the sound of a 40-year legacy instantly evaporating into thin air. My father remained frozen at the head of the polished mahogany table, his presentation clicker slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the carpet. Chloe sat completely immobilized in her oversized leather chair, her designer silk blouse suddenly looking like a cheap theatrical costume. The remaining bankers did not hesitate. They snapped their briefcases shut, their faces hardened into masks of strict corporate self-preservation. Within exactly 3 minutes, the room was empty of anyone holding a checkbook. The massive bailout loan was officially dead. The financial lifeline was permanently severed. The collapse of Sterling Global was not a slow decline. It was a violent, cascading failure. By the time I reached the ground floor lobby and stepped out into the rain, the lead bank representative had already initiated the freeze on their operating accounts. Financial institutions do not take kindly to being manipulated. When they realized the international contracts they were about to borrow against belonged legally to my personal company, absolute panic set in. The bank immediately pulled all existing lines of credit. The investors, terrified by the mention of an active federal audit, filed emergency motions to demand their initial capital back before the afternoon was over. Without my workflows to process the backlogged shipping manifests, and without the overseas vendors who explicitly refused to speak with anyone but me, the company was completely paralyzed. The logistics software remained a dead, useless screen. Cargo ships sat idling in ports from Shanghai to Hamburg, racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in daily holding fees that Sterling Global simply could not pay. By Friday afternoon, just 48 hours after our boardroom confrontation, the corporate bank forced the company into immediate liquidation to recover their massive losses. I watched the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my new office across town. I did not feel the need to gloat. Revenge is not justice, because destroying someone does not undo what they did to you. I simply watched the inevitable consequences of their own actions finally catch up to them. The federal courts appointed a liquidation trustee. The sprawling downtown headquarters, the very floors I had scrubbed and sacrificed my entire youth to maintain, were locked down. Desks were emptied. The fleet of delivery trucks was auctioned off to the highest bidder. My father's precious corporate logo was literally scraped off the glass doors by a hired maintenance crew. But the corporate death of Sterling Global was only the first domino to fall. The personal consequences arrived with the ruthless precision of a ticking clock. For my sister Chloe, the illusion of her perfect life shattered the exact moment the money dried up. Her husband Bradley was a man who measured love entirely by status and elite country club memberships. He had married the heir to a logistics empire. He had married a woman who was supposed to be the chief executive officer. When he realized that title was completely worthless and that his wife was actually facing potential legal scrutiny for a wire fraud, his loyalty vanished overnight. Bradley filed for divorce less than a month after the liquidation was announced. He did not fight for their marriage or offer emotional support. He simply packed his custom-tailored suits, moved out of their massive home, and left Chloe sitting alone in a totally unfunded reality. The McMansion she had purchased, using the funds stolen from my international contracts, became an unbearable anchor. Without the corporate accounts to siphon money from Chloe, could not even afford the monthly utility bills, let alone the staggering mortgage payments. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings by the end of the summer. I heard through the family grapevine that Chloe had staged a massive tearful breakdown on her manicured front lawn when the moving trucks arrived to repossess her luxury furniture. She had spent her entire life believing that tears would solve her problems because tears had always worked on our parents. But banks do not care about crying. The bank took the house, took the cars, and left her with absolutely nothing. The woman who had complained that the office coffee was not organic was suddenly forced to move into a cheap, cramped apartment and search for retail jobs at the local mall just to buy groceries. However, Chloe's downfall was mild compared to the absolute reckoning that came for my father. Richard Sterling had spent decades building a carefully curated image of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. He had judged everyone around him by their financial credentials while hiding his own massive deception. But the judge, presiding over his frivolous lawsuit against me, had followed through on her promise. She handed the forensic accounting ledger directly to the Internal Revenue Service, and the federal auditors descended on my father like starving wolves. The federal government does not accept excuses, and they certainly do not care about country club reputations. The audit revealed millions of dollars in unreported income offshore wire transfers and systemic tax evasion spanning 8 years. The very money my father had stolen from my grueling labor to fund his secret luxury lifestyle was now reclassified as criminal tax debt. To pay off the millions he owed in back taxes, severe federal fines, and legal fees, the government systematically stripped Richard of every single asset he possessed. His sprawling estate was seized and sold at auction. His vintage car collection was liquidated. His exclusive country club membership was revoked permanently, locking him out of the social circles he valued above all else. The men he used to play golf with suddenly pretended they did not know his name. He was left completely bankrupt both financially and socially. The man who had once stood at the head of a mahogany table and ordered me to keep doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes was forced to pack a single suitcase and move into a tiny rented apartment on the grim outskirts of the city. He had to take a low-level job dispatching trucks for a rival firm just to keep the lights on, answering to supervisors who were half his age and who did not care about his former glory. He was finally forced to live the small, diminished life he had always tried to force onto me. While their world burned to the ground, my world was just beginning to bloom. I did not build my new life on their ruins. I built it on the solid foundation of my own competence and the genuine trust I had earned over a decade of hard work. When the liquidation of Sterling Global was announced, my phone began to ring. It was not angry creditors. It was the overseas vendors. The manufacturing managers in Asia and the shipping coordinators in Europe reached out to me directly. They did not care about the Sterling family name. They cared about Claire. They knew I was the one who spoke their languages, who understood their local customs, and who had flawlessly managed their complex supply chains for 8 years. I officially launched my new firm, Vanguard Global. Because I legally owned the international contracts under my personal limited liability company, the transition was perfectly seamless. Every single vendor that had halted their shipments during Chloe's brief, disastrous tenure immediately signed exclusive agreements with Vanguard. I took over all of Sterling's former major contracts without having to steal a single client. They came to me willingly because I was the only person capable of doing the actual work. Within 6 months, Vanguard Global was operating at peak efficiency. I hired my own dedicated staff, paying them excellent wages and treating them with the respect I had always been denied. I implemented the automated workflows I had built from scratch, the very systems my father had taken for granted and Chloe had destroyed. The profit margins were astounding. Because I was no longer bleeding money to fund Chloe's McMansion or Richard's offshore accounts, the revenue flowed directly into my own business and my own future. By the end of my first year in business, Vanguard Global had tripled its projected revenue. I became a self-made millionaire, completely independent and entirely secure. The contrast between my new reality and my past was profound. I no longer woke up at 4 a.m. with my chest tight from anxiety. I no longer spent my weekends trying to fix catastrophic errors made by a sister who refused to learn. I bought a beautiful, light-filled home in a quiet neighborhood. I finally had the time and the resources to travel the world for pleasure, visiting the very cities in Germany and Italy where my shipping partners were based, drinking wine with them in bustling public squares completely free from the heavy, suffocating shadow of my father. Occasionally, the family grapevine would deliver whispers of my parents and my sister. Relatives would try to call me, attempting to guilt me into reaching out to them. They would say that my father was depressed or that Chloe was struggling to stand on her feet all day at her new retail job. They wanted me to step back into my old role as the family savior. They wanted me to open my wallet and fix the mess they had made. But I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. Setting boundaries is not betrayal. Saying no is not selfish. I realized that love is not a transaction and it is not a reward for being useful. I owed them absolutely nothing. I had spent my entire youth carrying their burdens, and I was finally allowed to set that heavy weight down. I politely told those meddling relatives that Richard and Chloe were experiencing the natural consequences of their own choices, and then I blocked their numbers. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering anger. I felt nothing but the clean, bright warmth of absolute freedom. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors that let you decide who gets access to your life and on what terms. I had permanently closed the door on the Sterling family, and in doing so, I had opened the door to my own extraordinary future. I proved to myself that I never needed their validation to be successful. I did not need a fancy title handed down by a corrupt patriarch. I just needed my own brilliant mind, my own relentless work ethic, and the courage to finally walk away. They had tried to bury me under their entitlement, completely unaware that they were just planting the seeds for my ultimate rise. Now I stand at the top of an empire I built with my own two hands, knowing with absolute certainty that no one can ever take it away from me. Exactly 12 months have passed since the heavy wooden doors of that corporate boardroom clicked shut behind me. Today, I am standing on a sunlit suspension bridge in the heart of Bavaria in Germany. The air here is incredibly crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees and fresh rain. I rest my hands on the cool steel railing and look out over the sprawling valley below. This bridge is not just a tourist attraction for me. It is a massive infrastructure project that my automated workflows helped supply. For years, I moved the raw materials for this exact structure across international borders, fighting through supply chain bottlenecks and translating complex logistics manifests late into the night. I used to do all of that grueling work from a suffocating cubicle while my father took the credit and my sister spent the profits. Now I am finally standing here in person, breathing in the mountain air and experiencing the physical reality of my own hard work. The contrast between my life today and my life a year ago is so profound, it often feels like I have been reborn into an entirely different universe. When I was the vice president of operations at Sterling Global, my existence was defined by a constant crushing anxiety. I used to wake up at 4 in the morning with my heart pounding against my ribs, terrified of what international shipping crisis had erupted while I was trying to sleep. I gave away the entirety of my 20s to that company. I sacrificed my marriage, my friendships, and my physical health because I truly believed that family loyalty demanded absolute silent endurance. I thought that if I just worked a little harder, if I just solved one more catastrophic problem, my father would finally look at me with genuine respect. I know now that love is not a transaction, and it is not a reward for being useful. You cannot earn the affection of people who view you strictly as a disposable asset. Today, my new firm operates under a completely different philosophy. I built Vanguard Global on the exact same flawless workflows and deep vendor trust that kept my father's empire afloat, but I removed the toxic elements. I set strict operating hours. I log off my computer at 5 in the evening every single day. I do not answer work calls on the weekends, and I extend that same basic human respect to the staff I hired. Because I legally retained ownership of my international clients, the transition was incredibly seamless. The overseas shipping partners in Asia and Europe were thrilled to continue working directly with me. Without the massive financial drain of funding, my father's secret offshore accounts, and my sister's lavish unearned lifestyle, Vanguard Global became astonishingly profitable. Within the first 8 months of operation, I completely replaced my previous corporate salary. By the end of the year, I became a self-made millionaire. I bought a beautiful, modest home in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors smile and wave. I sleep peacefully through the night without the heavy, suffocating weight of my family hovering over my chest. I have the resources to travel the globe, purely for pleasure, discovering the beautiful corners of the world that I spent a decade organizing logistics for, but never actually saw. I still hear whispers about my biological family through the extended family grapevine. Relatives who once eagerly participated in the smear campaign against me now occasionally reach out trying to offer unsolicited updates. They think that passing along the news of my father's downfall will somehow bridge the gap they created when they cornered me at that wedding reception. I never ask for these updates, but people inevitably talk. The reality of what happened to Richard and Chloe is a stark reminder that actions always carry inevitable consequences. When the federal courts forced Sterling Global into immediate liquidation, the illusion of my father's wealth shattered instantly. The Internal Revenue Service moved with ruthless efficiency to recover the millions of dollars in unpaid taxes and severe corporate fines. They seized my father's sprawling estate, his luxury vehicles, and his prestigious country club membership. The man who used to stand at the head of a mahogany boardroom table, dictating terms and treating me like a workhorse, is now living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. To pay his mounting legal debts, he was forced to take a job as a low-level dispatcher for a local trucking firm. He now spends his days sitting in a plastic chair, answering to a supervisor who is less than half his age. He is finally experiencing the small, diminished life he spent a decade trying to force onto me. Chloe did not fare any better. The moment the corporate money dried up, her husband Bradley filed for divorce and walked away without looking back. He had married the illusion of a wealthy chief executive officer, and when that illusion evaporated, his loyalty vanished completely. The bank foreclosed on her massive McMansion, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The woman who once complained about the quality of the organic coffee in the executive suite is now working retail at a local shopping mall. She spends 40 hours a week standing on her feet, folding clothes and dealing with difficult customers just to afford her groceries and her rent. She's finally learning what it means to actually earn a living. People often ask me if I feel guilty. They assume that because I am the daughter and the older sister, I must carry some lingering sense of responsibility for their current suffering. For 29 years of my life, I would have rushed in to save them. I would have drained my own savings account, opened my home to them, and willingly sacrificed my own peace of mind to pull them out of the wreckage they created. I would have believed that their struggles were my failures, but I do not feel a single ounce of guilt anymore. I feel absolutely nothing but the profound radiant peace of total freedom. I realized that setting boundaries is not an act of revenge. Revenge is not justice because destroying someone does not undo what they did to you. I did not destroy my father or my sister. I simply stopped providing the silent free labor that allowed them to live a fraudulent lifestyle. I stopped being the shock absorber for their massive financial incompetence. When I walked away and allowed them to experience the natural consequences of their own deeply unethical choices, they collapsed under their own weight. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors that let you decide who gets access to your life and on what terms. I permanently locked the door on their access to my energy, my intellect, and my wallet. Looking back, I can finally see the situation with crystal clarity. My father never saw me as a daughter. He saw me as a highly efficient machine that he could exploit to maintain his status. My sister never saw me as a sibling. She saw me as a convenient obstacle she could step on to elevate herself. They demanded endless sacrifice from me while offering absolutely nothing but criticism and manipulation in return. Walking away from them was the most terrifying thing I have ever done, but it was also the most necessary act of self-preservation I will ever accomplish. I saved my own life the moment I left my company keys on that country club dinner plate. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You might be sitting in your living room feeling exhausted and drained by a family dynamic that constantly demands you make yourself smaller so that someone else can feel big. You might have spent decades working a job that drains your soul or covering up for the mistakes of relatives who refuse to take accountability for their own lives. You might be the person everyone calls when there is an emergency, but the person everyone conveniently forgets when it is time to celebrate. I want you to know that you do not owe anyone your sanity, your financial security, or your future. Never let family loyalty become a cage for financial or emotional abuse. We are taught from a very young age that family is everything and that blood demands unconditional sacrifice. But loyalty is a two-way street. When you are the only one sacrificing, you are not practicing loyalty. You are being exploited. Silence and sacrifice are rarely rewarded by those who feel entitled to them. They will simply take everything you have to give, and then they will blame you for finally running out of resources. You have the absolute right to draw a hard, unyielding line in the sand. You have the right to demand respect, and you have the right to walk away permanently when that respect is denied. Choosing yourself is not a selfish act. It is a deeply courageous one. You do not need the approval of the people who hurt you to validate your own worth. Your worth is inherent, and nobody can ever take it away from you unless you hand them the keys. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family member or a toxic job to save yourself, I want you to type the word freedom in the comments below. Let this community see how many of us have found the courage to break those chains and start over. We draw strength from each other's stories, and your survival is proof that a better life is always possible. Before you go, please do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. I want to build a community of strong, independent people who refuse to be overlooked or undervalued. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I read every single comment, and I love connecting with you no matter where you are in the world. Remember that your peace is your most valuable asset. Protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.